The third season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer is really special to me. I distinctly remember the feeling of utter magic when watching through it my first time. I'd enjoyed season 1 well enough, and the high highs of season 2 had hit as hard as you'd expect them to, but there's just something absolutely electric about season 3. On a rewatch a couple years later, I was surprised to see that magic was almost completely intact. Returning to my favorite episodes has always been a massive joy, but it's been ages since I actually sat down and watched this whole thing. My last proper watch of season 3 would have been sometime around 2016. I'm happy to report that, despite my fear that the magic would be gone, my feelings about the season haven't changed. Season 3 is still absolutely fantastic, and I'm ecstatic to be able to gush about my single favourite season of any television show I've ever seen for the next however many pages of text. Please God help me. Season 2 left off on a real low note emotionally, with Buffy having just killed Angel to save the world and having run off to God knows where. Season 3 picks up a few months later with its premiere episode Anne, where we get to see where Buffy's run off to, and what that's meant in Sunnydale. In my Season 2 video, I talked about how that season's premiere, When She Was Bad, felt like a miss on execution of a pretty good idea. Buffy dealing with the trauma of the previous season's finale, and how the season 3 premiere went to a similar well for a better try at it. I still don't rate Anne very highly at all. In fact, I don't think there's a really fantastic season premiere in Buffy, with premieres in general being a weirdly weak spot for the series. Like When She Was Bad, looking at the bigger picture and what the episode is doing, I really do like Anne, where When She Was Bad focused on Buffy changing the way she behaved due to her trauma, and takes a very different direction by showing a Buffy who's physically isolated from the crew we've grown used to, interspersed with cutaways to the Scoobies, struggling to deal with living on a Hellmouth without the presence of a Slayer. The episode's packed to the gills with good individual scenes and solid plot beats. The very opening scene, where the Scoobies struggle with slaying a single vampire and then discuss Buffy's absence, is brilliantly information dense, showing us all we need to know about what Buffy not being there is doing to the group. There's likewise a ton of great moments with Buffy in LA, specifically meeting and getting to know Lily, who was formerly known as Chanterelle in the Season 2 episode Lie to Me, and the ways in which Lily comes across as pathetic and sad, which does a great job of setting up Lily's growth moment near the end of the episode, and also sets her up nicely for the more prominent role she will eventually play on Angel the Show. The plotline where Xander and Cordelia both psych themselves up into being insecure about the relationship is adorable. Giles flying all across the country to try and find Buffy is a perfect Giles moment. The wordless hug with Joyce at the end is almost the best thing you could think of. And of course, there's this banger of a line which sells the moment Buffy finds her strength again.
Who are you?
I'm Buffy, the Vampire Slayer, and you are?
Oh, also the Gandhi if he was pissed off thing.
Hey, Ken. Want to see my impression of Gandhi? Gandhi? Well, you know, he was really pissed off.
But when you don't zoom in only at the tiny little moments that don't matter structurally, and you don't zoom out to look only at the bigger picture, and, you look at what matters at the episode as an experience, I find Anne surprisingly boring. It's not unbelievable to me in the way When She Was Bad often was, where Buffy fell out of character. I much prefer Anne's depressive Buffy to When She Was Bad's mean girl Buffy as a response to trauma. This honestly does feel a lot like the way Buffy Summers would react to losing Angel. The issue is that there's no real interest to the plot. It's a fairly simple kidnapping mystery that doesn't really have the time to breathe under the weight of all the material that's more relevant to the season as a whole, and it encroaches on the episodic story's space. All the investigating we get is Buffy just happening upon the body of Ricky at one of his old hangout spots, and happening to notice the couple's tattoo he has despite him looking like an old man. From there, we just go straight to the cult house, and are pushed into a hell dimension where time moves really slowly. I love this concept. It sticks in my head as one of the creepier ideas in the show, especially people's brains being slowly broken by the repetition of I'm no one for years and years. But there's nothing done with it besides being shown it, and it's undercut by Buffy being irreverent the whole time. It can't feel that horrific that way. Nothing feels like it sticks. The episode has sketches of ideas, and it's not completely clear how they're all meant to fit together. By the time we get introduced to anything, we're already basically moving on, and it results in Anne being a really weird, rushed mess. Also, side note, but I can't not bring it up, the scene with Joyce, where she blames Giles for Buffy leaving, actually unbearable. Joyce is pretty good throughout the season, but this episode starts her off in full-out supervillain mode. I will remind you, Joyce, that you were the one to tell Buffy that if she left to go save the world, she wasn't allowed to come back home. Meanwhile, all Giles has ever done is be supportive, kind, and work his ass off trying to get Buffy, your daughter, back while you've sat at home moping. Joyce is in hot water right now from the fans' perspective, and seeing her do this to a character like Giles is actively repellent. This is your fault if it's anyone's, Joyce. Act like an adult and take some fucking responsibility. The loathing I feel for her in the scene is comparable to the series' most evil villains, and no amount of "you were hiding something from me" is going to make that okay, especially when her reaction to discovering the thing that was being hidden is to tell her teen daughter she's not welcome in her home anymore, and double especially when that kicking out moment was coded in the language of parents disowning their gay kids. Awful, awful scene. I don't know what they were doing. It baffles me. I do think Anne represents a really interesting contrast point with When She Was Bad, not in an immediate sense, but in terms of consequences. When She Was Bad represented a trauma very similar in magnitude to the trauma that's being worked around in Anne, actually dying versus the death of a loved one. But the consequences of Anne are going to ring out for much longer than When She Was Bad's, which were pretty much limited to the premiere episode. The very next episode, Dead Man's Party, is all about the rift that Buffy leaving for LA caused between her and the Scoobies, and there's tension that remains there even after Dead Man's Party, with several situations having Scoobies be worried that Buffy is just going to bounce again. It's a really good microcosm of the show's changing priorities, and how, as it goes on, it becomes less and less episodic and more serialized. Dead Man's Party is arguably an episode even more similar to When She Was Bad than Anne is, because this is the episode that plays on what When She Was Bad was actually focused on, with Buffy back in Sunnydale and a spotlight put on the tension between Buffy and the rest of the Scoobies. A big chunk of Dead Man's Party does the same awkward distance thing that the first half of When She Was Bad focused on, but in a much more successful way. The initial conversation with Joyce in particular nails the tone. The way that Buffy and Joyce seem to be unable to fully click together, it's some really high quality writing that leaves distance between them at every single opportunity. Xander covers for the fact that he's angry at Buffy for leaving with passive-aggressive jokes, unwilling to confront her and unable to let go. Willow seems to legitimately be trying to communicate with Buffy but failing, and being too afraid to get to the heart of the issue. Buffy is reluctant to invite her friends for dinner because it feels weird. All of this nails exactly what it's going for. There's a very clear gulf between Buffy and the Scoobies that neither side wants to or is willing to address, with just about the only comforting presence in her life at this point being Giles, who immediately welcomes her back and accepts her and fully understands how to treat her and what she's gone through. It's tough, and I think anyone who's had a fight with a close friend is going to relate to the way this episode feels. I particularly like the way the cozy get-together that is originally planned slowly turns into a big party.
You know what I mean. She doesn't want to talk about it, we don't want to talk about it, so why don't we just shut up and dance?
Well, Buffy said she did want to loosen up, have some kid time. Aren't you guys rehearsing tonight? Why don't you play at the party?
Yeah, I think I could supply some dingo action.
I'm not sure that a shindig...
Hootenanny.
Hootenanny is really the order of the day. It's maybe something a little more intimate. Buffy has just got home. I'm sure she's still feeling a little disoriented.
All the more reason to make her feel welcome. And a big party says, "Welcome, Buffy."
Everyone hiding from Buffy by either being with each other or disappearing in the large crowd. The thing I appreciate the most here is the way Sarah Michelle Gellar portrays Buffy's disappointment in this, and how obviously isolating it is for Buffy, as her home fills with strangers she doesn't know, in a way that's elegantly paralleled to the way she feels like she no longer really knows the Scoobies. Joyce, following on from Anne, is once again monstrous, albeit in a way that's not directly evil, as she gives the world's worst private talk to her friend Pat. She also then specifically blames Buffy for not taking her as her mother, telling her to leave her home, which, no. I'm sorry, Joyce, that shit is unforgivable. You do not get to resent Buffy for not taking it well. If you're a widow baby who can't deal, that's your bad. You're the adult, man up, and don't be a fucking monster. Still, aside from Joyce, I quite like the smackdowns that Buffy's friends lay down on her once Willow catches her packing up to leave again after she overhears her mother being monstrous. Willow's little smackdown in particular rings very true and specifically very fair, as she mostly just talks about how Buffy's leaving has hurt her without throwing blame on Buffy, other than just showing her the hurt. Starting with Willow here is a pretty good shout structurally, I think, because out of the Scoobies, she's been the most conciliatory throughout the episode, and Alison Hannigan's fantastic ability to portray Willow's vulnerable, nervous side really does make it feel like there's no ill will here. Willow is just very honestly hurt. Xander's speech about how selfish Buffy is for leaving feels a lot less earned and way harsher, but it's still a perspective that I find interesting and in character. This is Xander's self-righteous side coming out, and while it may be a bit lacking in empathy for Buffy on the surface, the way I interpret it is as coming from a place of hurt on behalf of the Scoobies she's left behind to deal with her mess. Since this very episode, we see Willow come very close to getting seriously injured. There's a self-righteousness there that come across as toxically masculine, telling this woman what's up, but I think Nicholas Brendan does a good job of imbuing it with enough genuine emotion that it walks past that line fairly fine. And the part where Xander insists that Buffy hear Willow out even if she doesn't want to because Willow deserves to be heard makes this feel more than selfish indignation. I also love the very brief Cordelia intermission into this fight, because it's surprisingly kind and empathetic, with her actually taking Buffy's side in her own way and understanding what Buffy's going through pretty well, maybe better than the rest of the Scoobies. It's a different, softer side of Cordelia that's going to become more prominent in the first half of the season as she's become a full-on Scooby at this point. The Monster of the Week plot in this episode, though, is fairly whatever, in a way that I think hurts its perception quite a lot. It reminds me of Inkamamiko. This episode is thought of as the one with the evil mask, which is easy to dismiss as bad and dumb, when it's really more the one where the Scoobies deal with Buffy's return. Also, there is an evil mask, which is a lot more compelling of a concept. Joyce hangs up a mask that brings the dead back to life as zombies. It's executed pretty well, actually, with a good sense of escalation and a pleasant enough little sidecurrent with Giles investigating and then getting to do some top-tier irritated banter.
Do you like my mask? Isn't it pretty? It raises the dead. Americans.
But it's entirely irrelevant to the A-plot, which is that of Buffy and the Scoobies sorting out their differences. The structure is actually very late Buffy feeling. It reminds me of episodes like Shadow or Gone, where the Monster of the Week structures are present but used as B-plots, as opposed to early seasons where the Monster of the Week is almost always an A-plot. There's actually quite a few more times throughout the season that I felt what I think of as late Buffy starting to materialize, which I'll point out as we get to it. I found this fascinating because I really didn't think that quintessentially season 5 feeling was present anywhere before the start of the 5th season, and yet here we very clearly see the crew experimenting with these ways of running the show. Clearly a big part of why Buffy changes so much is the writers are willing to constantly try new things. The purpose of the zombies and the entire B-plot is pretty much exclusively just to interrupt the Scoobies in the middle of their big argument and force them to work as a team. And I love the way it's accomplished, with Buffy and Xander, who were going at it the hardest, immediately jumping back into teamwork mode and coordinating nearly flawlessly. I'm usually pretty skeptical of the whole fight together to solve your interpersonal issues method of problem resolution in stories, especially as someone who loves and watches a lot of anime where it's overused to hell and back, but it works for me in this case in particular because the battle is designed specifically to show off how the Scoobies work as a unit. The tension dissolving here feels like a natural consequence of where their argument was leading anyway. It's like when you fight over something petty and then everyone feels bad about it and sheepishly forgives each other feeling silly, but to an elevated degree, it feels natural and tender and human rather than tropey. Dead Man's Party is this concept where Buffy's responsibility causes a rift between her and the Scoobies finally done justice, which is probably why it's not done again in any other season, at least not being approached from this specific angle. The faults of When She Was Bad are finally resolved, and I can move on with my life. Brother, I can't wait for the comment section when people hear me call Dead Man's Party the episode that resolved the faults of When She Was Bad. I am sure people are going to be highly sane. At this point, we move into an interesting trio of episodes. I love season 3, but every time I revisit it, my initial experience is disappointment, because I'm so hyped for the high points that stick in my mind that I forget there's a pretty decent chunk of season at the start that isn't actually all that good. I would argue that season 3 really hits its stride in episode 6, Band Candy, and the period before that is a weird little morass. As I just got done describing, the first 2 episodes are more about wrapping up the season 2 storyline than they're about setting up season 3. Anne is mediocre, and while I do think Dead Man's Party is great, they feel more like an extension of the previous season rather than their own thing. Next up is maybe the real first episode of season 3, Faith, Hope, and Trick, a boring introduction to Faith, who is probably the most central character of the season outside of Buffy. Then we have Beauty and the Beasts, a self-contained and not particularly good Oz episode, and Homecoming, which advances the Buffy and Cordelia relationship in a fairly satisfying if somewhat clunky way. It's hard to put my finger on what, if anything beyond their quality, makes these episodes different from the stretch of episodes starting in Band Candy, which I see as season 3 really hitting its stride. So let me just write this bit of the script and hope I unpack anything. I don't, I just sort of keep having the same opinion. Faith, Hope, and Trick is a remarkably forgettable episode, despite introducing 3 characters who'll stick around for a bit. I always have to look up what actually happens in this episode other than the introduction of the 3 characters in the title, because it feels incredibly perfunctory. In this episode, a new vampire rolls into town, Mr. Trick, who's taking sort of a Spike role. Unlike Spike, however, Trick does not make that strong of a first impression. He's got a distinct character and vibe to him, don't get me wrong. He's a decidedly more modern vampire. He's trendy and he's cool and he takes advantage of the conveniences of the modern world. He's good with tech and he does things like ordering a pizza in order to eat the delivery person. If Spike is practical, Trick is hip and, well, good with tricks. He feels like a vampire take on a businessman. The problem is, unlike Spike, Trick immediately feels disposable. Despite the differences between the two, he feels like a retread of Spike. We're introducing an unusual and more cool modern vampire in episode 3 of a new season. We saw how Spike turned out to not actually do that much as a villain in season 2, so we're primed to expect Trick to also be outranked soon enough. We're not going to vote for the same Trick again, haha. There's also just an energy to him in which he doesn't come across as all that significant. James Marsters has talked in interviews about how before having the Spike role, he'd played a bunch of bit parts in various shows, and not wanting to repeat that with Spike, he played Spike as a character that wouldn't be killed off, which ultimately worked. Whedon and the rest of the writers decided after seeing Marsters' performance to keep Spike around throughout the rest of the season rather than killing him off early on. I didn't really get what Marsters meant by playing Spike as a character that won't be killed off until rewatching this season with that line fresh in my mind. K. Todd Freeman is decidedly playing Trick as a character that will be killed off. There's no presence or flash to him despite his personality being lively and memorable. This is not meant as a slight on his performance. He does the job admirably and he has great charisma. It's just the job is playing a character who will be killed off. At no moment does Mr. Trick feel like the protagonist of his own story instead of a footnote in Buffy's the way Spike did. I got a single sentence into my synopsis of the episode before getting distracted for 2 whole paragraphs about Mr. Trick. The point here is that Mr. Trick rolls into town as part of the entourage of the demon Kakistos, who's in Sunnydale tracking down the major introduction of the episode, Faith. Faith's intro here is pretty darn good. I really enjoy that the first we see of her is as a fairly inconspicuous patron of the Bronze, dancing like anyone else. We then pan over to Buffy and the Scoobies, who have a whole ass conversation before Buffy sees Faith heading out of the Bronze with a vampire. I think that's a cool setup. It really puts us in Buffy's shoes and allows us to see the introduction to Faith as she does by allowing her to occupy the headspace of random Bronze chick in the audience's mind for a little longer. The turnaround in the alleyway when Faith kicks the vampire's ass is reminiscent of the very genesis of Buffy as a show, the idea of the defenseless girl turning around and beating the monster. The way Faith is casually talking to Buffy while fighting is also interesting and unique, because it's reminiscent of Buffy herself in some of the show's funniest moments, like when she's doing homework at the cemetery with Giles, but it's more casual than Buffy ever is during battle, and Faith spends the whole fight clearly enjoying herself, a very important distinction between the two Slayers. It's actually really good storytelling, immediately setting up the most difference between the two of them in a way that's relevant to both their immediate and long-term conflict. I also appreciate that it doesn't do an "I'm Faith, the Vampire Slayer" to echo Kendra's intro and Buffy's big moment in Anne. It's both a beat that feels too obvious to be interesting at this point in the show, and it would put Faith too in line with the other previous Slayers when a big part of her identity is that she doesn't fit into a Slayer mold. Good on David Greenwalt for not taking the low-hanging fruit there. Faith throughout the episode in general is just a really strong character. Eliza Dushku is nearly perfect in the role, making Faith seem effortlessly cool and dangerously unpredictable, while still being able to pivot into something incredibly full of hurt and fear when the occasion calls for it. At the risk of making Faith sound a much simpler character than she is, as an actress, being able to do those two things is pretty much all you need to make her really work. It's what defines her at the level of a performer. I think Faith, Hope and Trick does a very good job of highlighting that, with her charismatic wild side being on display as she gets to know Buffy, and her vulnerable side coming in at the revelation that she's in Sunnydale running away from Kakistos, who has killed her watcher and left Faith traumatized, in a scene that peels back her mask and reveals Faith for the scared girl she ultimately really is. It's an incredibly strong one-episode encapsulation of who Faith is, and even if we didn't get much other development, I think just from what we learn of her in this episode, there'd be a pretty believable arc with the Faith that we get in the later half of the season. Oh, also, homoeroticism. The Slayer gay metaphors from Becoming come back when Joyce refers to a
Slayer Pride Parade.
And there's going to be a lot of what comes across as flirting between Buffy and Faith for the rest of the season.
But I am going out with somebody. Tonight, as a matter of fact.
Really? Who?
Yeah, what's up? Hey, time to motivate.
Really, we're just good friends.
The final character in the title is, Scott Hope. He exists. He is the latest in the line of Buffy's boring normie crushes, following in from Season 1's Owen and Season 2's Ford. There is an upward trend here, I will concede, with Scott being at least a little more interesting than the other two planks of wood. He's the one pursuing Buffy to begin with, and he acts more like a genuine human with a sensitive side than either of the other two. I can sort of believe this guy would exist, and there are good moments between him and Buffy, like the bit where he's too dumb to not tell Buffy that Willow's the one who set them up to meet. But believability is only the first hurdle. He's generic and uninteresting, and being the third of this mold of boring dude means he feels even more cookie-cutter than he is. He's more Owen number 3 than he is Scott Hope. He's going to be a briefly recurring character, which could have been an opportunity to make him interesting, at least in his significance, by making him represent something for Buffy, which, to be fair, he sort of does. But it's nothing new. It's her inability and desire to be normal, which we already explored in Never Kill a Boy on the First Date all the way back in Season 1. I will track what he does to the best of my ability, but I don't really know why he exists other than to fill screen time. Well, I mean, Angel also comes back at the end of the episode out of nowhere, right as Buffy is finally trying to move on. It's not bad drama, but the actual scene just comes across as nothing and out of nowhere. Like, let's be honest. Angel isn't back because the story demanded it and him being there was the logical place to go. He's back because he was popular and because there's potential in a show about him running a detective agency in LA. Faith, Hope, and Trick is a pretty important episode, but it's not interesting. The Kakistos plot is just an excuse to get us to know Faith, and while her introduction is done well enough and conveys everything we need, it's also not outstanding. I'm not blown away by it the way I was blown away when Spike first showed up in the 3rd episode of his season. There's very little of interest here, and we generally just drift through plot points without any real lively spots. It's an episode that gets its job done and very little else, which I think will come to represent my problem with a lot of later Buffy. Somewhere between seasons 4 and 5, the show shifts into a much more plot-centric serialized storytelling style that leaves a lot of the episodes feeling like Faith, Hope, and Trick does, where they become this sort of grey plot mush. Their individual stories sacrificed in favour of the overarching plot. This is, I think, the first instance of that in the show, and it's also a criticism I'm going to make of a couple episodes in late season 3, not because it's particularly relevant to the season as a whole. I think season 3 is probably the best season in the series in terms of balancing episodic and serialized storytelling to create something both coherent in the long term and satisfying in the short term. It's just that I want to flag up this trend early, so that when more and more of the show becomes this way, I can point back to more isolated instances of it. Remember this complaint for my review of the 5th season of Buffy, which has about a 50-50 chance of coming out before the 21st century ends. Whenever I discuss this, I'm always afraid of coming across as too harsh on the more serialized approach of late Buffy, which I do legitimately quite like. So it's helpful that right after Faith, Hope, and Trick, we go into Beauty and the Beasts, a Monster of the Week episode that I have very similar issues with, in that I think it's a fairly dull experience. This is, on paper, our second Oz-centric episode, following on from the similarly mediocre phases, and I'm starting to see a pattern emerging. I don't like Oz episodes. I think I don't particularly care for any of the ones we get throughout the entire show's run, which makes Oz a tricky character for me to deal with. I began finding him grating near the end of the 2nd season, and part of that was that his stoic demeanor did not allow him to be vulnerable and relatable in the way the rest of the Scoobies were. Where the writing for everyone else oozes with honesty, Oz's ironic detachment sticks out like a sore thumb, and transmits an inability to be sincere and open in your writing that I've become less tolerant of as modern pop culture has become inundated with it. Ironically enough, to a large extent due to the massive success of Joss Whedon's works, and a misunderstanding of how his witty dialogue is meant to work. If anything, Oz is Whedon's dialogue not working. He is the exception that proves the rule. I pointed out during my discussion of Season 2 that Oz is a quality over quantity type of character, where because his personality is so detached, he's not allowed to have that many big emotional moments, so the ones he does have to really stick. If we see character-focused episodes as chances for characters to have those big emotional moments where we understand them better, Beauty and the Beasts is a complete and utter failure here. Oz does take more of a central role than usual, but I'm still half hesitant whether I should be even analysing it in the framing of an Oz-centric episode, because his role in the episode's emotional core is so tiny. His involvement in the episode is essentially limited to being suspected of killing someone early on, which prompts him to have a pretty okay moment when he's shook and storms out of a conversation, including this exchange with Willow.
Okay, you know that thing where you bail in the middle of an upsetting conversation? I have to do that. It's kind of dramatic, I know, but sometimes it's a necessary guy thing.
Which I find cute, if a little bit too far on the nose. And he's more involved than usual in the investigation of the monster du jour, who is Scott Hope's, see guys, he matters, friend's Pete, who is abusing his girlfriend Debbie and also drinking a Jekyll and Hyde potion. There's a brief period of time where it really does look like the episode's going to be about Oz, when he cracks under the pressure of thinking he's killed someone and takes it out on the Scoobies in an uncharacteristically emotional moment.
Oz?
Get away from the cage.
What?
It's gonna happen soon. Get away from me.
But we very promptly take a very hard turn into the Debbie and Pete storyline. The Debbie and Pete storyline is a whole lot. As the show has gone on, it's gotten a lot better at obscuring the things it's talking about behind a layer of metaphor that provides a screen through which we can comfortably look at uncomfortable subject matter, and which allows the show to deal with heavier topics more closely without being insensitive in ways like teacher's pet essay jokes, or Go Fish's SA themes, or well, listen, the show's not got a good history talking about SA. Debbie and Pete just take a hammer to that barrier of metaphor, literally just doing the world's most transparent domestic violence story, and simply making the abuser go all veiny when he's doing the abuse. I have to give it to the actors here. John Patrick White as Pete is able to move very believably between his caring sad boy mode and his monstrous mode, and Danielle Weeks does a very good job as Debbie, looking both scared and consoling in the post-abuse consoling sessions. Where I don't have to give any credit is to the ham-fisted, uncreative, over-the-top script that some fucking hack writer has given us. Who is this? Surely a one-timer who can't ruin the show. Oh, it's Marty Noxon, one of my favorite writers on the show, and who I think is underrated despite how highly rated she is. I don't know how this happened. This episode is far below her, it's just bad. A ton of the dialogue in this metaphor is just simply canned abuse cliches, the things that you say to make fun of bad writing.
You okay?
What? Oh, yeah. I'm such a klutz. Oh.
Fell down? Hit your eye?
Doorknob.
Before you jump to its defense, I know that it's not necessarily unrealistic. These are cliches for a reason, but it comes across so heavy-handed that it's nearly impossible for me to take it seriously, and it hits on the themes so hard that it completely feels like you're being condescended down to. It feels like a first draft where the obvious Jekyll and Hyde parallel with domestic abuse has been seen, we've written it down, and we've sort of stopped there. The idea is conveyed as obviously as possible, and we simply move on to the next episode. There are a couple moments I like how Debbie is the one to console Pete despite her being the one being abused, and how she's willing to shift the blame onto herself immediately.
Normally I'd say you want to play I Have a Secret fine, but people are dying here.
It's not his fault. I mean, he's not himself when he gets like this.
You mean Pete?
It's me. I make him crazy. He just does what he does because he loves me too much.
This is a more subtle aspect of abuse that is very true of many victims of it, but nothing interesting is done with it, and it's not like paralleled with Oz in any interesting way, making this Oz episode's core not have anything to do with the character who should be dominating the episode. If anything, Beauty and the Beasts is hijacked by Buffy and Angel, who have parallels to Debbie and Pete in the Angelus storyline, which are made even more obvious when a feral angel bursts into the episode to save Buffy in a moment of need, as though to assert that the monster with an angel is the biggest and baddest. Pete has fought Oz and won, but Angel beats Pete. Maybe this is just the way my brain reads it, and it's not intentional at all, but putting this stuff in a hierarchy like this feels so completely disgusting to me, and I really do not like it. Especially when Pete's abuse is presented in ways so directly linked to real abusive behaviors when compared to the much more metaphorical approach to abuse that Angelus represented in Season 2. I don't know, I really don't like it. It feels so very icky, and I just don't like the episode. For an episode that I don't like, I've talked a whole lot about it, and that's because I think it's also ridiculously overstuffed. There's like 2 or 3 episodes here, all competing for attention in the span of only one. The Oz is a killer stuff early in the episode could have carried a single episode, as could have Buffy discovering Angel's return, and the Debbie and Pete storyline. But instead we have all 3 storylines fighting for dominance in this cramped episode that doesn't really work out to anything other than bringing up highly touchy subjects in an incredibly on-the-nose way that's not really appropriate for how little time the episode has to give them. I've not even touched on seeing Faith working with the Scoobies for the first time and her outsider energy, or Buffy's relationship with the school counselor, or even nitpicked about how when Xander falls asleep on Ozwatch, Giles goes ballistic on him.
Woke up!
But when Buffy does it, he's not even slightly mad. I used to think I could never remember what happened in this episode because nothing happened, but I think it's the opposite. There's just too much stuff happening. There's too many competing threads for me to be able to glom onto any of them. None of them individually are explored in enough detail to stick in my mind. I feel a little bad labeling Homecoming as the last of the early season 3 run of mediocre episodes, because it is honestly pretty damn good. The only reason I think it's distinct from the run starting next episode, Band Candy, is that every episode from Band Candy onwards for a good while is an all-time great, and Homecoming is simply really good rather than absolutely extraordinary. Still, I need to not let myself be blinded by how good What's Coming is and not notice how good Homecoming is because of it. In a lot of ways, it's a perfect follow-up to Beauty and the Beasts because it's its polar opposite. Where Beauty and the Beasts is an episode I struggle to kill character-centric, which is made bad by the way it pulls in many directions at once, Homecoming is an episode I struggle to avoid calling character-centric, which is made good by the way it laser focuses on only a couple of ideas. This is the Buffy and Cordelia episode by excellence. The show has alluded to, and will allude to a couple of times, the idea that all that separates Buffy from having been a Cordelia is being called as a Slayer, that they're very similar to each other. The very first person Buffy bonds with in school in the pilot isn't Xander, Willow, or even Giles, it's Cordelia, and they seem to be getting along really great until Cordelia starts bullying Willow. One of my constant great disappointments with the show is that we don't really do much with this parallel, which feels inherently significant. Cordelia, especially in the early seasons of Buffy, before she matures and definitely before she moves to LA and becomes a better person, is a character who I've always struggled to like. Partially because I had a pretty bad time with bullying throughout my school life myself, and to be honest, I still sort of carry a chip on my shoulder about school bullies. People in the comments have talked about how much they liked Cordelia's wit, and I get it. She often is witty, and I understand how some of the really good lines she gets can be enjoyable, but her wit often makes me like her less. A bully being very good at bullying does not exactly endear them to me. I would much rather they be bad at doing bad things, you know? That said, this distaste for high school age Cordelia comes packaged with an increased appreciation for the moments when she gets to be more human and break out of her role as a dumb bully, which are incredibly plentiful in the third season. Throughout my video on the show's second season, I found myself unable to resist the temptation to include clips of small moments of Cordelia showing humanity, wanting to help and being worried about Giles in the Dark Age, for instance. And as she realizes more and more how much Xander means to her, I find myself really taken with how genuine the affection there is. Her playing along with his dumb nickname in the Buffy-less vampire hunting squad at the start of the season, the insecurity she has about talking to him returning to school in Deadman's Party, it's all really adorable and genuinely very, very likable. It shows off Cordelia's ability to care and be kind, and the way she's integrated into Scooby's throughout the start of the season and feels like a genuine part of the group has been really great. It was particularly strong in Beauty and the Beasts, actually. Homecoming is a very good cap on that arc, as it plays both halves of Cordelia simultaneously. Cordelia might have been softened throughout the past season or so, but she is still herself, and she's still got her genuinely vicious and unlikable moments.
How can you think it's okay to talk to people like this? Do you have parents?
Yeah, 2 of them, unlike some people.
But she's also a friend to the Scoobies, to the point where their allegiance is split between her and Buffy, even if a big part of that reason is that Cordelia simply thought to ask first. When Buffy positions herself as Cordelia's rival, she doesn't pull any punches, but it also doesn't come across unprovoked the way her bullying did in the first season. While she's not being a good sport per se, Cordelia is also not being mean for no reason, and that makes her a lot less unlikable. The rivalry might not be 100% friendly, but at least it's mutual for once. This feels more like a sparring session between 2 willing participants than it does an unprovoked attack, the way Cordelia's barbs usually did in the first season. The reason I don't want to call this a Cordelia-centric episode is that ultimately I do think it's Buffy who's at its center, with Cordelia simply being used as a mirror to bounce Buffy off of. The real core of this episode is a theme that we've used several times at this point to great effect. Buffy's insecurity about not being able to have a normal high school life, and the pain that her Slayer's sacrifices cause her. To be kept fresh, it must be a fully evolving theme, and it is. At this point, Buffy's fully accepted it, but it still stings, and Cordelia is a very good target for Buffy to discharge the anger that causes her, especially since the show can have Cordelia be inconsiderate about it without breaking character.
And the yearbook was like a story of me. Now it's senior year, and I'm going to be one crappy picture on 1/8 of one crappy page.
No, actually you're not.
What do you mean?
Well, you, missed the picture taking.
When? Why?
We did them yesterday.
Didn't Cordelia tell you?
The big conflict of the episode comes about from Buffy having piled on stress from 1,000 little things, from Scott Hope breaking up with her, he mattered guys I promise, to Cordelia forgetting to tell Buffy that she had to go take yearbook photos that would have meant a lot to her. Something that would feel out of character for any other Scooby other than maybe Xander, who still would have been a lot less blasé about it than Cordelia is. This ultimately comes to a boiling point when Cordelia accidentally hits Buffy right on the nerve when confronted about the yearbook photo incident.
Just because you were a guacamole queen when you were 3 doesn't mean you understand how this works.
Obviously, it involves handing out entirely lame flyers.
No. It involves being part of this school and having actual friends. Now, if it was about monsters, blood, and innards, then you'd be a shoo-in. Like to see you try to win the crown.
You would? Then you will.
And Buffy then finally acts out and decides to try to take the title of Homecoming Queen from Cordelia. It's a very simple setup, and it's maybe a little bit transparent to what the theme is, but I think it works out well, and it makes Buffy's insecurities here pretty explicitly clear independently of her conflict with Cordelia. But the obvious parallels between the two make it stronger and reinforce the theme. A big part of why her inability to be Homecoming Queen, to do normal high school stuff, gets to Buffy this much is because Cordelia represents her past self. Someone who could do that stuff, who very much did the school's queen bee. Of course, as one would expect, over the course of working together to survive the episode's action set piece, they get past their differences and understand each other and yada yada yada. But something that gets that unity across much more to me is the very end of the episode where we get the announcement of the Homecoming Queen. It's presented at first as the lame get-out-of-jail-free card that a much simpler show would use to get out of having to resolve this conflict by crowning one of the two over the other. It's announced that Homecoming Queen is a draw. It's then subverted by making the two people who have drawn for the title be two candidates who aren't Buffy or Cordelia. On the face of it, it's just a really good joke, but I think it actually also speaks to the growth of Cordelia as a character to have her lose to someone who, to us, the audience, feels insignificant like this. Over the past year, she started dating Xander Harris, the school loser, and in the process, she's lost her group of popular friends and presumably a lot of the prestige that comes with it. She's also started hanging out with Buffy's group and regularly fighting supernatural creatures with them. She's shown herself as being a pretty useful research asset for the team even. Cordelia has grown past the shallow queen bee type she used to be into a more complex person, who is legitimately in love with Xander and seeing past the surface level of someone who she in the past would have just called a loser. Cordelia is also now on good terms with Willow, Miss Hidden Depths herself, and who is the reason for the initial Buffy-Cordelia rift to begin with. She's on good enough terms with Willow, in fact, that Willow will pass on helping Buffy and help Cordelia simply because Cordelia asked first. Cordelia no longer has the social capital to win Homecoming Queen, but that has come with growth. She's lost social capital, but she's gained perspective and friends. I do think there is something a little bit troubling if you look at this way of showing Cordelia's growth too hard. In a way, the show's tying in the idea of a very classically archetypally feminine popularity with vapidity and shallowness, and I think that's sort of sad. Wanting or being able to win Homecoming Queen isn't representative of a character flaw, and using the inability to win it as a way of signifying growth is arguably looking down on it. It's got a I'm not like other girls, I'm quirky sort of casually misogynistic energy to it. Honestly, I'm not equipped to dissect that myself, and it's possible that I'm reading too much into it because I know what Joss Whedon was like behind the scenes, to Charisma Carpenter especially, so I'll just point it out and move on. It doesn't make the moment not work for me, but it does give it a slightly yucky edge that I wish wasn't there. I feel like I've been going on about Homecoming for ages, and that surprises me because I still have lots to say. It's actually really interesting, because my notes for the episode are some of the shortest in the season, and I expected to move past it pretty quickly, not thinking of Homecoming as an episode of notice. But there's still two pretty major topics I need to touch on before we go on. First, the easy one, the mayor is here. I like the mayor a lot. I'll have my criticisms of him later in the season, since I think he's actually one of the show's least interesting villains, but what he lacks in depth, he more than makes up for in affect. He's sort of a new take on the Master from the first season, in that he's a pretty standard evil guy who wants to do an evil thing. The only real thing that's arguably redeemable about him is his relationship with Faith, which we'll get to in the next video, but he's also affable and likable. Where the Master's affability and gentleness often come across as creepy and cold, the Mayor's warm personality seems to be mostly genuine and really come from the heart. He is a legitimate G-shucks affable goofball who cares about stuff like good hand hygiene, while also intending to, eat a graduating year's worth of students in order to become an immortal snake demon. In particular, his introduction, where we're primed to find him menacing despite him legitimately doing nothing even remotely scary to Alan, is great. We've heard menacing whispers of the mayor since all the way back in season 2, and because of that, in his introduction scene, we expect him to show off how evil he is like any other villain would. The music is scary, there's a knife we expect him to stab Alan with for evil's sake, like that one time the Master took out a vampire's eyes for fun, and then he does nothing bad in the moment, other than work towards his agenda in a banal way, giving orders about paperwork. I think it hits pretty close to home, specifically due to his position of power as a mayor. A lot of powerful evil people in real life are genuinely likable, they're fun to be around, care a lot about small things that are right, and then will perpetuate systems that spread suffering on a large scale. Charisma and being liked is an important tool in acquiring power, especially in a democracy, after all. I don't see why the fact that the supernatural is involved would change any of that. The mayor is still ultimately human, and we'll see through his relationship with Faith that he is capable of caring about people in a profoundly human way. We get very little of him this episode, since he promptly hands off the villain baton to Mr. Trick, who then hands it over to the various wacky mercenaries that will hunt Buffy and Cordelia through the woods in the big action climax, but the mayor will keep doing this type of shtick, albeit without the threatening camera and music, throughout basically the entirety of the season, only becoming overtly menacing once or twice, and it just keeps working. He's not only fun, but he's also believable in a more human way than really any other main big bad, other than arguably season 6's, depending on who you count as that season's big bad. It's one of my favorite things about Buffy. The villains are consistently fantastic. Every big bad, even a big bad I'd rank as one of the weaker ones in the show, like the mayor, excels in their own particular way, and has something worthwhile to add to the show. Other than season 4's. The other big thing that Homecoming introduces is the Willow and Xander cheating storyline. It's a bit of an out-of-nowhere moment on paper. The last real mutual moment of attraction between Willow and Xander was all the way in the first episode of season 2, 27 episodes and over a year of airing time ago. Though we did get Xander telling Willow I love you as she was unconscious in the hospital at the end of season 2. I interpreted that as romantic, but I know many people read it as platonic, including one or two of you who brought it up in the comments, and I can't blame anyone who does. It's a pretty ambiguous moment, and a romantic reading does feel out of nowhere at the time, since it both comes from and goes nowhere in the short term. There's not been any setup for this throughout early season 3, and suddenly we have this big scene, and it works, it's perfect, I really love it. It's a very measured scene, and it starts from a place of really intimate friendship. Not to take away from how effective the actual kiss is, but my favorite part of the scene is actually not the kiss, but the first half, where there's this real sense of ease and understanding between Xander and Willow. It's often easy to forget that these two are meant to be childhood best friends. They've known each other forever, and they've been around each other forever. Because we're in a TV show, they're almost always shown in stressful circumstances. In fact, on this rewatch, one of the big issues I'm finding having with Buffy as a whole is how little scenes like this crop up, where characters are just allowed to be around each other without a source of stress so that we can see them interacting the way we're meant to imagine they would off screen. But Here they definitely are. They're helping each other get dressed, reminiscing, being surprised at how much they've grown, and joking around. This is a rare case where a Xander joke elicits a giggle from someone in-universe. As they both end up dressed in formal wear and both end up looking absolutely fantastic, it becomes very understandable why this intimate, relaxed atmosphere and effortless connections they have would turn into a romantic atmosphere, especially as the two start dancing in this fantastic song, which I can't play you for fear of retaliation by the copyright gods, really sets a mood. This whole thing leading into a kiss feels perfectly justified within the scene. Honestly, the setup done in When She Was Bad and Becoming now feels obsolete. This scene was enough to make this entire plotline believable in and of itself. I especially like how they decide it's a fluke and end up feeling awful about it the entire episode. It really helps keep them likable as people, especially since part of the setup is them discussing how far each of them have gotten with their respective partners. I'll really quickly mention that an aspect of this whole plotline is made somewhat weird by Willow later coming out as gay. The show insists she's gay and never brings up the possibility that she's bi, so it seems weird that Willow would have these urges towards a guy so strong that she is physically unable to keep away from him for a good 3 episodes. I'm not gay, in fact I'm not particularly attracted to anyone, so I don't know how realistic all of this is. I know plenty of gay people have spoken about having genuine, passionate heterosexual relationships that mean a lot to them before realizing their sexuality, like Willow has with Oz, but it feels odd to have a character who goes through an entire storyline centered around having uncontrollable lust for someone of the opposite gender, and then later have them talk about they have zero attraction for the opposite gender. I don't know. I'm really not qualified to talk about this, and this may be a common experience for gay people to have, but as an ignorant ace guy, it feels off. Anyway, touchy topic aside, I'm going to finally finish off my discussion of Homecoming, but saying that I really like a lot of the way the Homecoming Queen election is handled. Seeing the Scoobies have their photos taken in ways that are believable to each of them is fantastic. Seeing Buffy and Cordelia squabble over votes is funny, and while I don't fully believe all the Scoobies would help Cordelia over Buffy, especially Willow, even with the added excuse of trying to make up for the fluke, I do think that it helps fuel the insecurity that motivates Buffy and works for the episode.
Slayer Fest 98
is a fun and cheesy way to set a variety of monster bounty hunters on Buffy and Cordelia, and seeing the two of them fight through them is really enjoyable, especially the moment when Cordelia manages to bluff her way out of a fight with Texture Gorge. It's just a thoroughly enjoyable episode all around. This is it. The next episode is Banned Candy. We are entering what I would consider the peak of Buffy the Vampire Slayer's run. The entire rest of the season is amazing, with only a couple episodes that I don't fully love, but specifically the run of 4 episodes starting at Banned Candy, continuing through Revelations and Lover's Walk, and ending with The Wish, is my absolute favourite part of the show, the very tippy top. These are 4 unbelievable episodes that I adore, both as individual pieces of television and as parts of the larger narrative spanning early season 3. None of them are my favourite of the show, and I think half of them probably don't even make my top 10, though I'm pretty sure all 4 of them do make my top 15. But Buffy is generally a show of ups and downs, and after each fantastic episode, there's usually a mediocre or bad one to even out the score, even without Season 2's weirdly inconsistent quality. I simply don't think there's another stretch of the show where the quality is so consistently sky high. It's like if Season 1 had had 4 Prophecy Girls in a row. It's nearly unfathomable. I beg you, do not take this as an indictment of any other chunk of Buffy. Think of it exclusively as the highest possible praise put on this specific part of the show. We are in for an absolute treat, so I ask for your patience as we quickly look back and take a short break to talk about writers, because something really significant just happened. We just got our last David Greenwalt written episode of Buffy. That's massive. David Greenwalt has been with the show from day one as co-executive producer, and his original role was writing Joss Whedon's worst excesses when it came to thinking like he was working on film rather than TV in. One of the things that really jumped out at me listening to commentary tracks included on the DVDs of the first 3 seasons is how often Greenwalt's name cropped up, especially when it came to practical solutions to filming problems. While Whedon is clearly the idea guy and the person who made the show what it was, Greenwalt seemed to be very much responsible in keeping Buffy grounded and attainable even when it was ambitious. It's an unflashy and unglamorous role, which doesn't really come across in the finished product. It's hard to identify the moments when something didn't go wrong that would have otherwise, but it's vital to the quality of the show, and the fact that Greenwalt managed to make a lot of the monetary limitations of early Buffy, especially in the first season, fairly invisible to the audience deserves a lot of praise. For all that I have my problems with the action scenes, finding them generally dull, the show almost never felt cheap or ramshackle to me. Greenwalt was clearly respected by a lot of the behind-the-scenes people and earned himself enough trust for Whedon to hand over the spin-off, Angel, to him entirely, taking on the role of showrunner, a massive deal. Unfortunately, when it came to his turns at the writer's chair, Greenwalt's had a tough time winning me over. In the overall weaker writing of the first season, it didn't stand out as much. Teacher's Pet was a clear low point of the season, but Angel and Nightmares both were perfectly in line with the season's overall quality. In the second season, I started struggling with Greenwalt's scripts. Ted and Reptile Boy are two of my least favorite of the season, and while I love School Hard, I think it's a fairly standard quality script carried more by the context it's placed in within the season than by its own content, even if Spike's intro is near perfect in that episode. Greenwald's scriptwriting contributions to Season 3 are Faith, Hope and Trick, which follows on perfectly with that trend, and Homecoming, which bucks it, being an episode I greatly enjoyed. My opinion of Greenwald's writing has shifted as I've rewatched the show. In Season 1, I described him as charitably being a dark and atmospheric writer and uncharitably being clunky, where in Season 2, I said he often put the message of the episode too far ahead of the actual story, but had a really solid grasp of the smaller character moments. I think all of those descriptions are true to some extent or another, but what I'm missing there is the normality of Greenwald's scripts, for lack of a better word. All of the episodes that Greenwald had a hand in, other than Teacher's Pet and School Hard, are episodes I struggled to remember in good detail, and that's not necessarily because they're boring. It's why I chose the word normality rather than dullness or boredom, but there's a stability to them. There's a standard approach to his writing that's unsurprising and unmemorable. Memorability itself is a double-edged sword, however, and Greenwald handily mostly avoids cutting himself with it, avoiding being memorable for the wrong reasons as much as he dodges being memorable for the right reasons. His writing feels solid and stodgy, but that's not necessarily an insult. There's a workmanlike reliability there that I can really respect. Greenwalt does his job perfectly when you need an episode like Angel, which doesn't necessarily to be phenomenal in its own right, but which is load-bearing. I don't particularly enjoy many of his scripts, but I also don't find myself dreading any of them like I do several scripts by my nemesis Dean Batali and Rob Des Hotel. Even weaker episodes like Teacher's Pet, Reptile Boy, and Ted are watchable in their own deranged little ways. See you later, David. I don't know if I'm reviewing Angel yet, but if I do, I will see you then, believe you me. We're finally actually getting to Band Candy, which happens to be the series' introduction of a new super important writer to take over from David, Jane Espenson. Espenson is tied for second most scripts written overall with Marty Noxon, both of them clocking in at 23 scripts throughout the show's run. That's one episode under a whole 6 of the show each, and one episode more than a standard-length season each. Espenson has a bit of a reputation as the funny writer among the Buffy fanbase, and looking at her introduction in Band Candy, it's easy to see why. I wonder how many people are going to have their feathers ruffled by me including Band Candy in this run of episodes I hype so much, because while it is a universally really liked episode, it's also not actually a particularly impactful one. There is a theme present here, but it doesn't feel especially significant or relevant at all to the show as a whole. As teens rue being controlled by adults, adults are suddenly all reverted into a teen mindset thanks to magic chocolate. And so, teens get to both see how difficult adults' lives dealing with them are, and how the discipline the adults represent is necessary. It's got a very Season 1 School as Hell vibe that I really appreciate, especially in its empathy to both sides, completely understanding how much it sucks to be a teen, but also not just being uncritically on teen's side. But Ultimately, and let's be completely honest here, that's all just an excuse in order for Band Candy to deliver a metric truckload of fun. This premise allows for all the shenanigans one might expect, with the show taking a lot of time to show us Giles and Joyce roaming the streets of Sunnydale as a tough guy delinquent and a hopelessly infatuated groupie. It's funny just on a surface level, it's a very good gag, but it's also humanizing and endearing to see the place these characters were at this point in their lives. We knew of Giles' past as Ripper, but seeing Joyce turned into an extra from Grease makes perfect sense while still being shocking enough to be amusing. These are two pretty tightly wound characters, and seeing how they were before becoming so tight wound is enlightening. It's also just frankly interesting to see Giles in his bad boy phase. It's made extra delightful by the fact that both Anthony Stewart Head and Kristine Sutherland kill it in this episode. Their performances are objectively really over the top when you think about it, but they come across as weirdly naturalistic in the moment, maybe because it's so uncanny seeing these performances coming out of these characters. Tony Head gets to use his actual real-life accent, which isn't the posh Queen's English we hear Giles usually spouting, but a much lower-class North London accent, which fits his tough boy music head persona perfectly, and which also actually gives a fantastic in-universe little tidbit if you think about it for a bit. Giles' accent is put on. He grew up with this fairly filthy North London accent, which I think is hilarious and also pretty in character. Meanwhile, Kristine Sutherland just oozes desperation to be noticed, coming across as needy, insecure, and low-key insanely horny, which I also love. It's archetypal, but it's believable. It feels like it's coming from a real place, and picturing the arc that would lead this girl into becoming the highly respectable Joyce is both a little funny and a little sad. Buffy has had to grow up way too quickly, but it's easy to see that Joyce has grown up more, and also has lost some of her old identity along the way. The other adult I love in this episode is Snyder, who comes across as a lonely, underlooked nerd who can't get any attention or friends, which is such a lovely little humanizing detail. It perfectly explains how he'd grow into the impotent little dictator he is as an adult. It's astonishingly sad, despite how hilarious Armin Shimmerman's performance is. His enthusiasm and desire for friendship here is genuine, and yet there's still a pathetic and unlikable element in his grasping for attention that makes it easy to understand why he can't get friends, and that carries right through to how pathetic he is as a petty tyrant of an adult. It's the arc of a lot of sad, shitty men in the real world, losing the elements of themselves that are likable and doubling down on the bad aspects of their behavior to take their rage out on the world. Meanwhile, while this trio of adults is getting up to shenanigans in the B-plot, Buffy and company go through a similar rising tide of absurdity as what Xander went through in Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered back in Season 2. It's not quite at the same level of farcical as Bewitched was, but that's because the farce isn't the focus here. The escalation starts small with secretly teenageified Joyce allowing Buffy to drive, then gets large with the Scoobies arriving at the Bronze, where we get to see adult actors have the time of their life chewing the scenery as horny teens. Seriously, everyone here seems to be absolutely loving life. And then it switches to a smaller scale absurdity when Buffy meets up with her parental figures, Joyce and Giles, and has to herd them around by acting like the adult in the room for a change. It's really fun stuff, and that final step in the escalation is the one I find most interesting, and maybe the thematically crunchiest bit of the episode. We don't really know to what age Joyce and Giles have reverted mentally, but judging by the levels of horniness on display, it's definitely somewhere in their later teens, meaning they're at most 1 or 2 years mentally younger than 17-year-old Buffy at this point. But the difference between them, Buffy, and even the rest of the Scoobies is night and day. Buffy does legitimately come across as completely a different level of maturity to Joyce and Giles here, which I think is an indicator of how quickly her and the Scoobies have had to grow up, what with dealing with Hellmouth stuff. More than that, I think it's an interesting role inversion. It's that typical Saturday morning cartoon plot where the children wish for the parents to be gone, and when they're gone realizing how much they rely on them. The movie that started the Jimmy Neutron series was about this. But it's cleverer than usual, because here Buffy is having to navigate the same issues with Joyce that Joyce usually has to navigate with Buffy. By putting Buffy, our perspective character, in Joyce's shoes, we, the audience, are allowed to more clearly understand Joyce, especially if you take into account the show's target audience of teenagers. I honestly think this is a much more convincing argument for teens that their parents have it hard and that they should be given a break every now and again than almost any other instance of this story I've ever seen. But Let's be honest here, that's still a pretty flimsy theme to base a whole episode around at the end of the day, so I'm not going to post hoc justify my love of band candy through it. One of the things I would like to never lose track of is the ability to value art for simply being fun, especially as I get more into writing critique and putting it out on the internet. When you start feeling like you're somewhat good at media analysis, it's easy to get yourself lost in the weeds. You feel so much smarter having a discussion about theme and meaning, about the philosophy of a piece of art, but this carries the risk of losing the simple joy of art, which is the reason any of us ever got into art in the first place. I didn't get into Buffy because it was clever. I got into Buffy because it was fun to watch, because the writing is funny, the characters are likable, and the stories are thrilling and touching. Band candy is that sort of good, simple, unpretentious fun, unburdened by the need to say something profound or meaningful, unconcerned with leaving the viewer a better person than they entered. And that's good. That's valuable. There's so many fantastic moments in Band Candy. Snyder being fall deep about murdering babies being bad.
Something's gonna eat those babies?
I think that is so wrong.
The mayor seeing demonic bargains as campaign promises, which is funny while saying something pretty real about him as a character and showing what he values. Joyce being unable to say anything to Giles when she's clearly into him.
Must be exciting being from England.
The mayor being into sewer maintenance. Ethan. I love Ethan. I wish he was around more. He's perfect as an excuse for these sort of episodes, and these sorts of episodes are always great. Ultimately, Band Candy probably doesn't matter. If there was a mediocre Monster of the Week episode here instead, Buffy as a show wouldn't go down much in my estimation. But man, it's so much fun. It's so distinctly Buffy. I have a blast watching it every single time I go through, and that's more than enough. If more stuff was able to be just as fun as Band Candy is, art would be much better than it is. And art is already pretty darn good. Hot take there. Because I'm a highly normal person, I often find myself looking through the Wikipedia list of Buffy episodes, and whenever I get to this chunk of episodes, I always obviously remember thinking that I think of it as the height of Buffy, but I also always catch myself looking at Revelations and going, maybe this chunk would be even better if Revelations wasn't here. That's a stupid instinct. Every time I watch Revelations, I go, oh yes, that's why I think of it as part of Buffy's peak. But I do still understand why I forget about Revelation's strong points, because on the surface, it's really, how would I say this, like Monster of the Weekish, I guess? There's this phrase that echoes in my head, it's the one with Gwendolyn Post. And there's a real dismissiveness to that. It feels like it's a one-note idea that can't really carry an episode. That's wrong. Gwendolyn Post can and does very much carry the episode, but it's also unfair to a lot of the other things going on in Revelations, which is a highly layered and complex episode if you really look at it. Beyond Gwendolyn Post and the obvious progress she represents to Faith's story, there's some massive progress to the Evolving Angel storyline. There's also some really nuanced development to the Willow and Xander cheating storyline that's going to be incredibly important going into the next episode. We also get to see a side of Giles that we hadn't seen before. There's the seeds of Xander and Faith's relationship, foreshadowing for the Mayor and Faith's relationship. There's a whole lot packed into these brief 40 minutes, and a lot of it is incredibly effective, so effective you might not even realize it's really there. There's few episodes of Buffy that feel busier and denser than Revelations does. It's a fantastic start for our newest recurring writer on the show, Douglas Petrie, who's going to write a total of 17 episodes for the show over its runtime, and also spend a good amount of time as executive story editor. Petrie is a weird one for me. He's a writer whose name has always been familiar to me, but I've never paid attention to his episodes the way I've tracked someone like Martin Oxon or Jane Espenson, or even my nemesis Battalion des Hotel. So I'm coming into this watch through without a preconceived notion of who he is as a writer. I'm excited to see where he takes the show and what I can see about his writing style as I try to track him more carefully. Looking through his credits in advance, it seems like his writing quality starts off sky high in Season 3 at least, writing 3 of my favorites of the season in Revelations, Bad Girls, and Enemies. Then he continues to be mostly solid in Season 4, only to fall off a cliff in Season 5, at which point he starts writing forgettable to bad episodes, reaching a nadir in Season 6 when he pens As You Were, one of the show's absolute lowlights, though he does occasionally research to write an all-time banger like Fool for Love. I noticed that Petrie is responsible for 3 of the best episodes for Faith in Season 3, as well as This Year's Girl, the first half of the Season 4 Faith two-parter, so I think it's fair to say he's great at writing for Faith, if nothing else. Revelations by itself is proof of that, as it's some of the most human and complex Faith feels throughout the entire season, partially because it's the darkest and most frustrating she's allowed to be before her heel turn during Bad Girls and Consequences. Not to get too ahead of myself, but during this rewatch, I actually struggled quite a bit with understanding what was going on in Faith's head during her stint as a villain at the end of the season. A lot of it feels contradictory and inscrutable because Faith herself is full of contradictions, but I think the real key to understanding Faith actually lies here in Revelations, which serves as a look at Faith's self-destructive tendencies that isn't hidden behind the veil of open villainy and antagonism that she'll put up in the season's second half. Something that I really like about Revelations is actually the early part of it, where we get to see Buffy and Faith's, I don't know if friendship is the right word, but mutual understanding? They're able to joke around together and have conversations about boys that aren't devoid of tension, but that feel pretty natural and mutually engaging. The vibe here is mostly co-workers who enjoy each other's company, but don't even remotely want to hang out outside work, which is pretty fine by me. I like plenty of people like that. When that's not the vibe is sweltering sexual tension, which they actually come pretty close to just acknowledging out loud.
Really, we're just good friends.
So, that's fun. A really interesting part of the episode is seeing Faith slowly fall under Gwendolyn Post's wing and proceeding to self-sabotage in her relationship with the Scoobies, where she's finding a legitimate home. Sure, her relationship with Buffy isn't super warm, but it's cordial enough, and she's welcomed pretty heartily into the Scoobies as a whole. Her place here doesn't feel any more distant than Cordelia's circle in the middle of the second season, and at this point Cordelia is a fully fledged Scooby, so there's a very clear road for Faith to be integrated into group from here. She's only a stranger in the sense that they've literally not known her for long, not out of any dislike or unwillingness to integrate. But the thing to understand about Faith is that she is ultimately an incredibly insecure character, and that there's incredibly easy ways malicious actors can take advantage of that. For how abrasive and unpleasant Gwendolyn Post is throughout this whole episode, being unpleasant to Giles and generally looking down on the Scoobies, she manages to get into Faith's good graces shockingly quickly, and it's through the use of 2 tactics. The main one is coming across as a strongman, a parental figure that can take care of Faith and in whom Faith can put her unconditional trust. This is vitally different from Giles, who is a parental figure for Buffy for sure, but who doesn't make a show of it. His support of Buffy is quiet and almost behind the scenes, to the point where it's not even clear if Buffy is fully cognizant of it. Post, on the other hand, makes a show of putting herself above Faith, posturing as stronger, more reliable. The second strategy that Post uses is to undermine Faith's already fragile bond with the Scoobies by very unsubtly implying that they're leaving Faith out on purpose and don't trust her as much as they say they do. It's a manipulation tactic, but it's one that knowingly or unknowingly precisely hits at Faith's weak points, and it's a really interesting prelude to Faith's relationship with the Mayor, who demonstrate very similar tendencies to Post in the way he interacts with Faith, though with more plausible deniability when it comes to manipulating her consciously. This is not helped by Faith coming into very direct conflict with Buffy here through the revelation that Angel is back, which throws not just Faith but the Scoobies into disarray. I actually really like the way the Scoobies find out, which is through Xander stumbling across Buffy and Angel in the cemetery. He specifically talks about how dumb of an idea it is for him to go out alone, and how he's doing it to alleviate his guilt over cheating on Cordelia with Willow. Him taking out a stake and immediately preparing to kill Angel is stupid and reckless, but it's fully in character, and he witnesses Buffy and Angel having one of those unrestrained kissing sprees he's currently been having with Willow, and which he was literally just talking about feeling guilty about, which is a nice parallel. The reason I like this is because the next scene has Xander being incredibly awful to Buffy, partially about the fact that she's keeping it a secret, which is an incredibly rich thing for the guy to do when there's very much parallels going on here, but it's incredibly clear that he's as mad at her as he is, partially because he's mad at himself, which is also a satisfying parallel to Faith, who is convinced the Scoobies don't trust her so easily, partially because it's clear she doesn't trust herself either. Still, the big intervention scene is a pretty unexpected turn in a very pleasant way. It's that commitment to consequences that I keep banging on about. It comes unexpectedly out of nowhere, because the normal way a show would handle something like this is for the character who's returned from the dead to be fairly easily returned to the fold in order for us to be able to continue on with a comfortable status quo. But there's real fallout to Angelus's actions in the last season in this one. Rationally or irrationally, not a single one of the Scoobies is able to trust Angel anymore after everything they lived through at his hands. Willow is clearly worried for Buffy, Cordelia is scared for herself, and Oz doesn't trust that the same course of events won't unfold again. Over the course of the last season, I found myself often sympathizing with Xander when it came to his wariness of Angelus and his desire to just have him get staked. He'd often be incredibly mean about the way he spoke about it, but his point would be true. I'm somewhere in between here because we're no longer dealing with Angelus, we're dealing with Angel, and when Buffy brings up Xander's old jealousy of her, it actually does ring true once more. Not necessarily literally in that I think Xander's got any feelings for Buffy going on, but in that he's once again motivated by something more than just wanting to do good here. He's motivated by resentment and fear, as well as his ongoing internal struggle with guilt about what he's got going on with Willow. While I wouldn't demand a single one of the Scoobies forgive Angel, he's also distinctly and textually not the same person as Angelus, and so the vitriol Xander spews on Buffy here seems unwarranted, even while his points about being unable to trust Buffy and Angel together do feel somewhat valid. We, as an audience, find it pretty easy to distinguish Angel and Angelus as characters and people, but I bet we'd have a much harder time of it if we weren't watching these events tucked safely behind the fourth wall. Xander's making an understandable point, but he crosses the line so damn far that any sympathy I have for his position is incredibly hard to hold on to, hauling the blame for Miss Calendar and the rest of Angelus' victims onto Buffy, which isn't fair in any circumstance.
If I thought for a second that Angel was going to hurt anyone...
You would stop him. Like you did last time with Miss Calendar.
But despite this, the most upsetting thing about this whole confrontation is the little exchange Buffy and Giles have after everyone else has left.
I won't remind you that the fate of the world often lies with the Slayer. What would be the point? Nor shall I remind you that you've jeopardized the lives of all that you hold dear by harboring a known murderer. But sadly, I must remind you that Angel tortured me for hours, for pleasure. He should have told me he was alive. You didn't. You have no respect for me or the job I perform.
It's just heartbreaking, especially after Giles was able to be fair to Buffy in the group meeting just before, because it really shows that this comes from his heart. Unlike Xander, Giles is able to control his emotions and think things through logically here, but that doesn't mean he's any less hurt. Giles is wrong about Buffy not respecting him, of course, but can you blame him for feeling this way after everything he went through at the hands of Angelus? The only real complaint that I have here is that this is basically forgotten about by the next episode. There's no real tension between Giles and Buffy stemming from this moment, so it feels inconsequential. In a way, I do get it. Giles is mature enough to realize this isn't how Buffy thinks about him once he cools down, and it would be out of character for him to hold a grudge this way, but for such an emotional moment, you'd at least expect a little more of a payoff, at least a moment where Buffy does something for him that proves she does respect him throughout Revelations. We're not even done yet, because I'd feel awful passing by this episode without mentioning Willow's part in it. It's not a big one, it's mostly just her feeling bad about her indiscretions with Xander and being incredibly cagey and cute, but Alison Hannigan is a master at this stuff, and she completely nails the performance. Willow is funny and charming, and it's even a little touching in how genuine her regret is, even if it's not enough to stop her from, cheating on her boyfriend. This whole episode leads to the first big confrontation between Faith and Buffy, when Faith goes to kill Angel, spurred on by Post so that she can grab the big glove MacGuffin du jour. I love how it seems like Buffy will be able to resolve this with words. She gives Faith a big speech, and not only is the speech heartfelt and convincing, but Faith actually looks like she's buying it. Right up until Post interferes and continues to press on Faith's pressure centers, highlighting just how easily she's able to mold her to her will, and how that isolation tactic she's used on her has made it easy to turn her against Buffy. The resulting action scene is one of the best choreographed ones in the series so far, and it's pretty tense in that friends to enemies angle, with Post using her position as a trusted ally to get into Xander and Willow's good graces and get to the glove, only to immediately turn on them after they've shown her kindness. The immediacy of the betrayal feels awful, and it helps Post be one of the most viscerally hateable villains the show has had so far. The fact that her first act after obtaining the glove is to belittle and insult Faith, who's put her trust in her above the Scoobies, is also significant, driving Faith deeper into her isolation.
A word of advice. You're an idiot.
Her trust in the Scoobies harmed by Post, and her trust in Post betrayed, unable to truly believe anyone cares about her. The fact that her newest parental figure has not only betrayed her, but then also gone on to die in the most metal way possible, hand chopped off, struck by magic lightning, then vaporized from the inside out, doesn't really help. Faith's line at the end of the episode when Buffy comes to try and mend bridges,
I'm on your side.
I'm on my side, and that's enough.
is pretty much a direct consequence of this, and it's fantastic character building. It's such a great encapsulation of what Faith's lacking, what she's looking for, and the ways in which Buffy has learned the lesson that Faith is failing to learn in this episode, and through much of the season. Buffy started this season living a fake life in LA because of the lessons that she's trying to share with Faith here, and Faith is simply unable to learn them from Buffy. Oh, and Xander softly admits fault at overacting about Angel.
Are we cool?
Yeah. Just seeing the two of you kissing after everything that happened, I leaned toward the postal. But I trust you.
I don't, just for the record.
That's actually incredibly important to me for how small a line it is. I would have liked a bit more of an apology, but the fact there's an apology at all means the big conflict between him and Buffy feels resolved. And by having Xander do the apologizing, the show clearly takes Buffy's side on an issue where she's decidedly in the right. If anything, one of my recurring problems with Xander so far in this more critical rewatch, and one that the fandom seems to share, is how rarely the show has him explicitly apologize for being in the wrong. So this is refreshing. All in all, Revelations was, well, the Revelation episode of this rewatch for me. I can't believe I wrote that into a script, because I underrate how much I'm going to like it every single time. I did not expect it to do nearly as much interesting stuff as it did, and I think it's got some of the best grasp on these characters out of any episode of the show thus far. There is not a single character in this episode who comes out looking bad or feeling underserved, and it's a phenomenal first step on Faith's villain arc. While things aren't going to hit the fan for another third of a season, this is where the seeds of Faith falling out with the Scoobies are really planted. Also, there's some points throughout the season that are often read by fans as early signs of Willow coming out as gay next season, but let's be real, the relationship between Buffy and Faith in Revelations is the gayest thing in all of the show so far, and we've already met Larry. Following this frankly exhausting string of bangers, we move into an episode that I'm not actually sure of the title of. Lover's Walk. There may or may not be an apostrophe somewhere in there. In the DVD menu, it's got an apostrophe before the S. On most online sites, it's not got an apostrophe at all, which apparently originates from the production script. I like the apostrophe-less approach the best, and it's the one that I've always had in my head as the real title. A big part of it is that I just like pithily clever little titles. It turns the title from a poetic possessive, the walk that lovers do, to a declarative, lovers are walking. That's weirdly subversive of expectations, and it's also an apt descriptor of what happens in the episode, but it doesn't seem to belong in an episode title, so I don't know. I think the thing that struck me the most in Lover's Walk is how much it feels like late Buffy. When I think of late Buffy, I instinctively think of the thing that makes it resonate less with me than early Buffy does, the sort of connector episode. I'm talking about episodes that don't really have that strong of a central identity, and that are thus harder to qualify as Monster of the Week or serialized. Season 5, the most vanilla late Buffy season in my mind especially, is replete with them. There's episodes like No Place Like Home, Checkpoint, Blood Ties, or Tough Love, which in the process of writing this I remembered the names of off the top of my head, but which I can't necessarily place the events of, because they're much more pieces of a running storyline than they are their own little stories. This is not to say nothing memorable or interesting happens in them. A quick Google search reminds me that Tough Love is the fantastic episode in which Tara's mind gets broken by Glory, or that Checkpoint is the episode where Buffy finally asserts her authority over the Watchers Council and we learn that Glory is a god. But what I do mean is that they're not as easily described as the one with X. Revelations, as I said earlier, was the one with Gwendolyn Post, and was the one where Buffy is in LA. Band Candy was the one with the band candy. Tough Love is the one where Buffy is struggling to fill the void left by Joyce's passing in parenting Dawn and deals with projecting authority, while Tara and Willow have relationship issues which are nominally centered on Willow's worryingly rapidly growing power as a witch, but are deep down really fueled by her insecurity, and then Glory eats Tara's mind. It's not exactly as catchy and easy to remember, and also really hard to do in one take. Lover's Walk doesn't necessarily have that issue. It can be described catchily. It's the one in season 3 where Spike briefly comes back. But it's the first episode in the show that structurally really does feel like a later Buffy episode. Spike's presence is memorable, but it's actually subservient to the season's overarching plot more than it is the selling point of the episode. Revelations, the one with Gwendolyn Post, very much does move Faith along her character arc in a manner that will have lasting consequences, but it is still primarily interested in its own story, in introducing Gwendolyn Post and in moving the characters to the places they need to be for the big Buffy Faith fight at the end. Stuff like Angel's return being revealed or Xander struggling with his attraction to Willow happens in the process of telling the story of Gwendolyn Post. It doesn't feel like the reason the episode exists. Gwendolyn Post is the reason the episode exists. The intention of Lover's Walk, on the other hand, seems to first and foremost be to be a bridge between status quos, to move us from a position where Willow and Xander are happily dating Oz and Cordelia, but are attracted to each other, to a position where they're no longer dating those people and their mutual attraction has been almost completely subsumed by a sense of guilt. Spike is simply there as a tool to facilitate this and a thematically interesting contrast to their story, and to just be fun. This is not at all to say I'm disappointed by Spike's presence in the episode. Lover's Walk is some of the best Spike we've had yet, or will have ever. There's a bit of criticism of Buffy about how much Spike gets defanged as the show goes on, turning from an incredibly menacing character to effectively just comedic relief. And while it is a criticism I'm unbothered with, that downward trajectory, as much as it does exist, very much starts here. This is not the Spike we saw in season 2, who, even at his lowest point, wheelchair bound and getting clowned on by Angelus, came across as dangerous and scheming. This is a changed Spike, destroyed by the loss of Drusilla and just generally pathetic and weak. Even his very introduction is played as a joke, where he's indirectly called a moron shortly before attempting to repeat his iconic introductions from season 2, but comedically failing at it.
What kind of moron would ever want to come back here?
Home, sweet home.
Throughout the rest of the episode, he puts together sort of idiotic plans that barely work, and any moment where he's even remotely threatening is made comedic. Like the delightful bit where anyone he kidnaps is mostly used for him to complain to about breaking up with Drusilla, which is just as good when it happens with Willow as when it happens with Joyce. This is important because Spike is essentially a warning here. The big consequence of Lover's Walk is the dissolution of romantic relationships, and in Spike we get to see what sort of consequences that can wreak on people. Because all of the 4 people involved here are more sensible and mature than Spike. I mean, I guess the jury's out on Xander for maturity. We're not going to see them anywhere near as demolished as Spike is, but the idea that things like this can be so hurtful is an effective one to implant in the episode, as it not only makes the episode itself more interesting, but it implicitly heightens the stakes of the fallout by giving us an extreme worst-case scenario. This is what a bad breakup can do to a person, if that person is immature, selfish, stupid, and violent enough. It's also interesting lore-wise. I've always thought that it's interesting that Drusilla and Spike seem to have legitimate feelings for each other. Throughout season 2, and here, it becomes clear that if Drusilla does have those feelings, they're at the very least considerably more malleable than Spike's. But Spike actually holds on to his adoration of her even through a painful breakup and is racked with pain for it. Spike is just such a unique vampire, and the implications of the way his vampirism works will continue to be highly interesting throughout the seasons. The way Spike shows clear warning signs of abuse is also fascinating. I mean, there's the clear and comedic line about tying up Drusilla and torturing her until she likes him again, but there's also genuinely unfunny bits which are just pretty directly taken from standard depictions of abusive behavior, like this whole part from after he kidnaps Willow, which is genuinely pretty scary and hard to watch.
I'm gonna get what's mine. What's mine? Teach her to walk out on me. What are you staring at?
Nothing.
You can do it, right? You can make Drew love me again. Make her crawl.
I can try.
What are you talking about trying? You'll do it!
Yes, I'll do it.
You lie to me, and I'll shove this through your face. You want that?
No.
Right through to your brain!
No, please, no.
What I like is that it immediately shifts into Spike making himself the victim of his relationship with Drew, which, because this is a TV show which has primed us for comedy, does work as a pretty funny and humanizing moment, but at the same time is 100% perfectly consistent with real-life abusive behavior, where violent outbursts will be followed by performative self-flagellation and self-victimization. Spike's whole deal here matches up nearly perfectly to textbook abusive manipulation, and it makes me wonder how the Spike, as opposed to Season 7 Spike, who's gone through several seasons of character growth, would act if he had a soul, whether this abuse is inherent to his character or is a product of his lack of empathy caused by a lack of soul. Nurture or nature, I suppose. Spike aside, the episode's core is divided into two plots. The A-plot, centering around the romantic stuff between Xander, Cordelia, Willow, and Oz, and the B-plot, about Buffy going to university. I really like both of them, with the romantic plot being the clear center of the episode. We actually start right on it, in a scene that's such a perfect microcosm of the entire way this dynamic has worked out that I'm sort of in awe. Willow and Xander walking together, having a casual, intimate conversation, which works perfectly well as a conversation between close friends, but which threatens to turn into something more right as they're interrupted by Cordelia and Oz walking up, at which point we see why the current non-cheating pairings work so well. There's a burst of really cute Xander and Cordelia banter where Xander gasses her up while putting himself down, and Cordelia is charmingly, and importantly comically, self-aggrandizing, a subtle but reassuring bit of standard Oz humor designed to comfort Willow, and comfortable familial banter between Xander and Oz. Like, in barely a minute, we get a perfect feeling for all the character dynamics here and are reminded why the current status quo is so comfortable and works so well, how the characters really click. It's absolutely classic Buffy. It gives us something that makes us happy, and it makes us remember how happy it makes us right before it's taken away from us. Even outside of this intro, the episode is front-loaded with incredibly cute coupley moments between the two pairs. When Xander is happy to see pictures of him and Cordelia in her locker, and the fact that she put them up at all, knowing her, my heart honestly melts, imagining the state they were in at the start of the previous season. The Pez Witch dispenser is the most adorable thing in the world, and Willow's flustered reaction to something so small is, frankly, just cruel and unusual punishment to the audience, knowing what's coming barely half an hour later. The middle half of the episode is a lot less remarkable for this plotline. It's not got nearly as many good moments, nor does it do much beyond simply advancing it in the sense of Willow turning to magic to try to sever the attraction between Xander and herself, but it is interesting in the long term. This might be the first unambiguous instance of Willow's tendency to run to magic to attempt to solve all of her problems in cases where it's not appropriate. We are given reason to doubt her spell safety, and if it wasn't interrupted by Spike, it's very possible this would have devolved into a Monster of the Week episode where, like, Willow accidentally turns herself into a raven who exists entirely to plug Xander's eyes out or something. But beyond that, and even if it had turned out alright, it simply has shades of the very serious ways that Willow will very much abuse magic in later seasons. I think it's a good addition to Willow's character, who's maybe been missing serious flaws till now. The only thing about Willow as a person that's felt flawed is her insecurity and occasional emotional cowardice, but it's rarely played for anything other than laughs. Here, it's turned into something more serious, where her tendency to run away from the things that are hard for her has pretty horrific synergy with her competence in magic, which allows her to find cheap, easy, and often harmful ways around things she finds emotionally difficult, and which will become a much bigger crutch for her as she gets better at magic. Less importantly, but way more excitingly, the Magic Box. The shop Spike and Willow visit during the episode is the Magic Box, a set that anyone who's watched Buffy post-season 4 will be intimately familiar with. This might actually be canonically the same building, as Giles does buy out a pre-existing magic shop. I tried to figure out whether it's known as the Magic Box already, and there is a piece of writing on the bag the shopkeeper hands Willow, but even going frame by frame, it's too blurry to make out what it says. The two last words might be Magic Box, the lengths seem to match up, but I'm by no means sure. Hello, it's editing me. As you can pretty clearly see on the screen right now, what I just said was wrong. You can pretty clearly see that the bag says Uncle Bob's Magic and then a 3-letter word that ends with G. I'm pretty sure it's bag, since it looks like it starts with a B in the motion blurred frames before. The reason I couldn't see it before this is that what I used during the writing process is a standard definition DVD release, which is both blurrier and less widescreen, and you really can't tell anything there. What you're seeing on screen is the HD remaster from a couple years back, which is widescreen, and so we can see the bag when it's not in motion here. Usually, the HD version is significantly inferior to the standard version, since the show was shot for 4:3, so the new aspect ratio throws off how a lot of shots look, plus you can often see things you're not meant to, sometimes even equipment and crew, but in this particular case, that worked in our favor. Anyway, this confirms that the Magic Box used to not be called the Magic Box, and was presumably called Uncle Bob's Magic Bag, which is an awful name. Unless Uncle Bob's Magic Bag is just the bag that the shop Uncle Bob's Magic Box uses? That would be quite weird. Anyway, fascinating. Back to your regularly scheduled me. By the time Giles buys it a year later in season 4, it's already named the Magic Box. The shop does have a tendency to get its owners killed, so it is quite possible it's renamed at some point down the line between owners. There's a lot of talk on the DVD behind the scenes about how tight the set budget was for the early seasons, so I don't think it's entirely fair to call the set a throwaway. They were almost certainly planning to use it for more than this one episode, but it feels so bizarre to see a place that's going to become so central to the fabric of Buffy used in such a casual and, well, throwaway manner. Moving away from highly exciting tangents, a lot of the early episode is also dominated by what I will reluctantly call the B-plot, which consists of Buffy struggling with the fact that she can sort of go to university. I'm a big believer that execution is a massive part of storytelling, and a mediocre premise can be carried by fantastic execution, and that's just what's happening. I mean, rather than a mediocre premise though, this is a repetitive good premise. We're doing What's My Line again. Buffy is confronted with the idea that she might have a future, and she struggles to make that work with the fact that she's a Slayer. Admittedly, it's a different take to What's My Line. Buffy here is a lot more cognizant and accepting of the fact that being a Slayer is who she is. It's part of her identity, and she doesn't want to run from it the way she did in What's My Line, an episode largely about coming to that very realization. Lover's Walk sort of tackles the question from the opposite side. Rather than wanting to leave, Buffy sort of struggles with finding a logical reason to stay now that Faith can handle Sunnydale for her, despite intuitively feeling it's the right thing to do, eventually simply confronting the fact that she just wants to. More than a fresh new idea, it's a coda to an old one, and that shouldn't be anywhere as exciting and interesting as Lover's Walk makes it. Simply put, the interactions Buffy has with everyone are nigh perfect. Sarah Michelle Gellar is killing it throughout this episode in what might be a Stealth series best performance for her. It's nowhere near as flashy as the episodes where she really gets to emote, but the way she carries this quiet discomfort with her throughout the episode, not like she's suffering, but like she's got something unpleasant nagging at her constantly, is really palpable, and she knows how to turn the dial on that to move from comedic to sympathetic perfectly as the script demands. Combine this with the fact that she gets a bunch of really interesting perspectives from the people around her in scenes where the characters are working also perfectly. Seeing the reaction from everyone around her is almost as interesting as seeing hers, and you really do have yourself a highly effective and memorable B-plot. If I was mandated to have a complaint with Lover's Walk, it's that the middle third is sort of fillery. There is a decent chunk of episode where things just sort of happen, and Buffy and Angel have to spend time messing around with Spike until we can get to the big climax of the episode where everyone walks in on Xander and Willow kissing. However, I am not mandated to have a complaint with Lover's Walk, and as such I can simply say this. That whole chunk is delightful fun, full of some of the best jokes in the series and entertaining character dynamics. This is the payoff for being so meticulous about characterization throughout the series. You can just sort of have the characters walk around for a bit in the middle of your big episode and it fits right in. Spike is also just amazing. James Marsters clearly allowed himself to use his acting quality quota for a whole season in this one episode, and he nails everything. I only realized this structural problem while really thinking the episode through for this script. On a watch-through, even a critical one, I'm just too taken with the episode to notice. It's fantastic writing, plain and simple. Which is also what the final third is when shit really hits the fan. We're about to get pretty bleak here, so I want to start with acknowledging how funny the episode is in concept. Spike shows up in Sunnydale, dejected and broken, fucks up a plan to get Drusilla back through magic, gets in a fight, which cheers him up immediately, and leaves Sunnydale feeling great, all while having wreaked havoc in the lives of the main cast, almost all of whom are left emotionally or physically damaged after his passage through Sunnydale. The man is a literal emotional vampire, and it fits his rude dickhead aesthetic perfectly. This might be the most Spike that Spike will ever be allowed to be in his entire tenure on the show, and I really love it. There's two really major events in the climax. Buffy and Angel going through some real shit in their relationship, and the breakup of the two couples the show has at the moment, with Cordelia and Oz walking in on Xander and Willow kissing, which is a shockingly phenomenal moment. I really, really love how it's done on a technical level, with the audience being put in a perspective we are pretty used to by now, Xander and Willow as they kiss. There's nothing to indicate anything's going to go wrong, and Cordelia and Oz sort of walk in out of nowhere without the scene emphasizing them. It feels like we're just in a standard pan around a kissing couple until we suddenly realize there's other people there. It's a fantastic shock moment, and the fact that it very suddenly transitions from emotional drama, Cordelia storming off and Xander chasing after her, into life-threatening drama is doubly shocking. In a lesser show, this might feel like unearned stakes raising, but Buffy has done way more than enough to earn its audience's trust, so this moment instead simply comes across like a cascading of painful moments, like everything that could go wrong is going wrong. You ever have that feeling where it just seems like the bad news has decided to all come at once in the same hour? That's what I'm reminded of. Unfortunately, once we get back from a cutaway from the love stuff to the Buffy and Angel story, there's a moment that I do absolutely hate. There's a brief exchange between Xander and Cordelia, and then we cut to a funeral for a few beats, only for Buffy and Willow to walk in front of the camera talking about how Cordelia is going to be okay. This is meant to be a joke. It is not a funny joke. I do not like it. I think it sucks major balls. It's only momentary, and it doesn't ultimately matter that much, but I dislike it enough I thought I had to mention it anyway for a whole paragraph. Fuck this joke. It's a bad joke, and despite how quickly it goes by, it really undermines your audience's trust in you as a storyteller when you show you're willing to sweep the rug out from under their feet like this. It is also simply just not the time for a joke. Don't put jokes like this in your stories. I will now reiterate, fuck this joke. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. From here, the episode's actually really simple, and it almost has no words in it. There's a brief, absolutely devastating scene where Xander visits Cordelia in the hospital, where we get to briefly see her honest and devastated. There's a painful heart-to-heart between Buffy and Angel about their relationship. There's a very effective montage of all the characters looking sad, set to sad music, Willow's even holding that Pez dispenser, and there is Spike, having the time of his life, singing along to the music in his car as he speeds down the highway away from Sunnydale. Absolute perfection. Just what an episode. Before we move on, we are due for a writer break. The perfection that is Lover's Walk is written by Dan Vebber, his third ever credit after writing 2 episodes for Space Ghost Coast to Coast. He's actually a very odd addition to Buffy's lineup of writers, as most of his career on TV has been spent on adult animated sitcoms. He's most prolific as a writer on The Simpsons, closely followed by Futurama and American Dad, but he very notably spent a very long time specifically as executive producer of Futurama. He also wrote 3 episodes of Daria immediately after Buffy, which is significant to me personally, because Daria is the only TV show I've ever watched that I might consider a worthy rival for Buffy for my favorite of all time. It seems like Dan knows how to land himself a gig on a great show at the very least, but he's also pretty talented. I think I've made it clear that I like Lover's Walk a decent amount, but he also writes the absolute banger The Zeppo later in this season. His Daria episodes are pretty good too, if not particularly outstanding. Somehow finally moving on, The Wish is an absolutely sensational episode and one of Buffy's highest points so far, definitely the highest point in this set of high points. It's not unseating the really good plot episodes, Prophecy Girl or Innocence, but it's easily my favorite episode of Buffy outside of that, and I think might remain my absolute favorite Monster of the Week episode throughout the show's entire run. I honestly don't know where to begin gushing here, so I'll very simply just squee with glee about the fact that OMG Anya is here. It's actually really interesting seeing her here at a point before she becomes the character that she is throughout the rest of the show. She seems to be a lot more socially adept and able to understand social interaction than she will be when she joins the main cast. There's specifically a bit where she's talking with Cordelia about Prada that feels completely impossible for the Anya I know and love to be involved in.
Nice bag. Prada. Good call. Most people around here can't tell Prada from Payless.
I think the thing that stood out the most about The Wish to me this time around is how interestingly structured it is. I always think of it as a Cordelia character-focused episode, and it's easy to understand why. Cordelia is the character who sets the plot in motion, and she's the most predominant POV character for the first 25 minutes of the episode, a time in which we get to really understand her in new ways and see her hurt over her breakup with Xander. In the 25th minute, however, she is unceremoniously killed off, and the episode is taken over by an alternate dimension Giles. It's such a bold structure on paper that this might sound like a recipe for disaster, since we're now effectively getting 2 sort of stunted character episodes forced into one shell, but it just works. Part of it is that the things that both halves of the episode say about their respective lead characters are actually really simple and don't really need a full episode to be said. Cordelia's half is about her dealing with her emotions around Xander. She is clearly hurt and isolated, losing her friends in the Scoobies in the breakup, but having cut ties with Harmony's Mean Girl gang when starting to date Xander. There is a lot of pretty effective stuff there that's designed to kick Cordelia when she's down. I particularly like this cut, from Buffy talking about the importance of friendship and carrying her through hard times, to Cordelia in the process of symbolically isolating herself from the Scoobies, but the episode is just really effective at making you feel for her. She is clearly trying to work herself back into bitch mode, the way she spent a lot of the first 2 seasons, but she can't quite get there. She's stinging a lot more than she's willing to let on from Xander's betrayal, maybe even that she's willing to admit to herself, and that only goes to show how much he really did mean to her. It's hard to imagine this is the same character who I thought the show was being too nice to during When She Was Bad. It really does feel awful to watch her in this state, but at the same time, I really did struggle writing even that paragraph about this. For all that it's an emotionally effective thing, and The Wish absolutely does it perfectly, there's really not that much to say about it. You can show it from a few angles: Cordelia in her room cutting up the photos, Cordelia trying to hurt Xander's feelings by pretending she's already hooked up with someone else, Cordelia being dumped by Harmony and the Mean Girl gang, Cordelia on the borderline of accepting Buffy's held out hand of help before the worst timed vampire attack of all time. But ultimately, they're all variations on a theme, and I don't think there's enough to carry a full episode here. You need another plotline, which is where the alternate world and Giles' point of view really helps pick up the slack. Before we move on though, I want to discuss the rest of the main timeline Scoobies here, who I think are written pretty much perfectly. Willow is, as expected, dying of need for forgiveness and validation of her negative emotions, leading to my absolute favorite Oz moment of the show so far, where he's just allowed to be So clear-headed and harsh, but absolutely fair. Considerably less harsh than he's even allowed to be given the circumstances, I think. Xander is, as per usual, acting really immature, half-heartedly attempting to shift the blame off himself in ways that are both clearly jokey and slightly more serious. But it's endearing rather than obnoxious, because it's only ever a half-hearted attempt that puts him firmly in the wrong. Listen, I've read the comments. I know a lot of you are 100 on board for the Xander hate train of the later years, so this admission might not be taken well, but I relate a lot to Xander. He very often reminds me of myself when I was around his age, and, well, I completely understand the thing the writing is trying to portray here, this sort of performative big gesture to try and shake yourself out of a feeling you're having that's destroying you inside. And you realize that the gesture is sort of shitty in spirit, but you're fine going through with it, partially because you feel bad, and partially because you know it doesn't mean anything, it's only performative, and literally the only effect it has is you feel better about yourself for about 3 microseconds before feeling bad again, and... What I'm saying is, I think the Xander moments are pretty relatable. But more than Xander and Willow, I really like how Buffy is portrayed here. She is on Xander and Willow's side, willing to offer moral support, but at the same time, she is sort of siding with Cordelia over them, recognizing that they are in the wrong.
I'm here for you, Xand. I'm just a Porto gal. I just feel a little weird about this us against Cordelia thing. She's had a rough time.
She goes as far as to go help try to give Cordelia a pep talk, when that almost works for what it's worth, and she tempers all of her support of Xander and Willow in making sure she recognizes that Ozzy and Cordelia are the real victims here. That's just such a Buffy Summers attitude. Yeah, she'd do that. I love it. She's great. The most memorable part of the wish obviously happens once Cordelia makes the titular wish and is transported to the timeline where Buffy never came to Sunnydale, in large part due to the weird post-apocalyptic setting and the twisted version of characters we've already met, but I really like a lot of the subtle, not so subtle, foreshadowing of the fact that Sunnydale's gone to hell in Buffy's absence before that's more explicitly shown to us. One of Harmony's cronies tells Cordelia that she likes her dress because it's daring, which Cordelia finds strange because it's not daring. There is a brief allusion to a monthly memorial, and of course the curfew. It's such a fun wink and nudge that it's just entertaining to sit through. And once Cordelia makes her way out of the school and wanders the street of Sunnydale at night, the atmosphere radically shifts from that playful, almost comedic tone to grim and grimy. This is a Marty Noxon episode, by the way, and she has unlocked her true power. Her ability to control the extremes of the tonal spectrum is fucking superhuman. The Dark Sunnydale is a delicious blend of a heaping serving of grimdark with just a couple little bits of camp absurdity and cheese to take off the edge and make the episode not feel overwhelmingly dark. There's a lot of really pretty genuinely disturbing stuff in here, from smaller details like the humans the vampires keep in cages for feeding on, to big shocking moments like Vampire Willow and Xander casually murdering people and feeding on Cordelia, and the scenes of Vampire Willow torturing Angel for fun. All this could feel overwhelming and out of character for a lighthearted show like Buffy, but it's tempered by the fact that the Master's back chewing the scenery, that the vampires hang out in an extreme version of the Bronze, or that the big plan the vampires are trying to carry out is using a machine to suck blood out of people and serve it in wine glasses. The result is an episode that still feels like a goofy Buffy Monster of the Week episode, while not losing any of the desperation and sadness that will carry Giles' arc throughout the second half of the episode. It really does feel like a dark, sad, fallen world, and the line it has to walk to make those two tones mesh is so thin that I can't believe the episode never once falters and swings too far into either extreme. Before moving into the star of the second half with Giles, I do have to talk about the vampire versions of Xander and Willow, which are really interesting and fun. Vampire Xander feels like Xander trying to put on a bad boy act, but because Nick Brendan does ultimately have that sort of charm, it doesn't feel forced in the way that Spike intentionally sometimes does. It's like the demon that replaced Xander's soul got rid of his inhibitions, and he's free to live out the version of himself he thinks is coolest without anything holding him back, especially not the fact that it's really shitty. Vampire Willow, on the other hand, at first blush seems like a completely different character to the Willow we know. Not only is she more confident, which I guess is to be expected from a vampire, but she's playful in her malice in a way Willow never was. But seeing future seasons and seeing Willow in her worst moments, I fully believe she has the capacity for this kind of malice too. It's just buried much deeper than Xander's is. Vampire Willow is also pretty gay. Like, she seems way too into drinking the blood of women, and there's going to be a little moment with her in an upcoming episode that's explicitly called out by the show as gay.
It's horrible. That's me as a vampire. I'm so evil and skanky. And I think I'm kind of gay.
Willow, just remember, a vampire's personality has nothing to do with the person it was.
Well, actually, that's a good point.
This is what I was referring to when I said that Season 3 is often seen as the genesis of Willow's gayness by the fanbase. However, it's worth noting even the uninhibited and pretty obviously into women vampire Willow is still into Xander, which to me would mean that a Willow without heteronormative societal inhibitions still also likes men. I don't know, it really does feel like the show's later insistence that Willow is explicitly a lesbian is a teeny tiny bit of bi-erasure for fun. Not something I'm necessarily mad about, considering how important Willow is to the history of LGBT representation on TV as it is, but maybe an imperfection. Once again though, I'm not gay, lesbian, or bisexual, so I'm willing to defer to people who have first-hand experience with these things. Once we move from Cordelia's point of view into alternate universe Giles' one, the episode shifts drastically in both tone and focus. We're obviously no longer as worried about Cordelia's teen drama, and instead we've got something with the tone of a Season 5 or Season 7 episode of Buffy, a ragtag group fighting a hopeless fight against an overwhelmingly powerful foe. The fact that I'm comparing just regular vampires to the likes of Glory or The First should say everything that needs to be said about how convincing the episode is in showing Buffy's positive impact on Sunnydale. However, one of the most interesting things here is a look at a side of Giles we don't get to see very often. Instead of Buffy's mentor and advisor, he is essentially the protagonist of this version of Sunnydale. He's at the heart of the effort to resist the Master's forces the way Buffy is in our version of Sunnydale. This means that we get to see the side of Giles that's capable of hoping against hope, and that believes there must be something better than what's immediately in front of him, centered and motivating him throughout the episode. It's not a side of him that's absent in the main timeline by any means, but there it's usually very much tempered by the requirement that he be the brains of the operation and think more logically. Wrangling 3 teens and their rotating group of friends in the fight against evil often means that he's forced to be the realist that opposes the idealism of the younger generation. His genuinely hopeful and idealistic side is only allowed to shine through rarely, almost always in quieter and more intimate moments with Buffy, or when he's given her advice on her relationships with other people rather than helping her kill demons. Both types of moments where we see that Giles is ultimately a very hopeful person. In this alternate universe though, Giles sort of has the Buffy role. He has to be the hopeful center of the White Hats and encourage them to keep believing and fight the good fight. The more dire circumstances also mean that he is capable of believing in something better than his current situation a lot more easily, and it's really endearing seeing him really get invested in fixing the world. All he's really got is a few cryptic words from Cordelia before she dies, and this sends him on a quest to alter reality in what comes across as a fascinating mix of genuine hope and end-of-the-rope desperation. The scene he gets talking to Buffy in his house, where Buffy's battle-hardened and cynical and Giles gets to play the idealist in their dynamic for once, is incredibly effective. The episode just leaves me loving Giles more than I already did. It's a phenomenal exploration of an aspect of his character that's usually very subtle, and centering it in this way where the rules of the world are fundamentally different to the rest of the show allows for a closer examination of it that doesn't feel forced. I mentioned that Buffy is in the later half of the episode, and she's maybe the weakest link here. The difference is that this Buffy is battle-hardened and doesn't have friends. She effectively tells us as much.
Look, you want to stay here and play make-believe, fine. Not gonna be any help to you anyway. There's only one thing I'm good at.
But at least let's muster some kind of force.
I don't play well with others.
Disappointingly, it is not used as an interesting contrast with Faith. This Buffy is unsurprisingly not as evil as Faith, and without that or any other aspect of thematic connection explored in any depth, it's not a very interesting take on the character. We don't see a direct contrast with Faith. There's no moment which feels like alternate Buffy acts in a way Faith would act due to their more similar paths. A moment where you would expect her to like Faith, but she doesn't. Or even a moment where she meaningfully doesn't act in the same way that our Buffy would. She's just sort of jaded and grouchy, but she still has a tiny bit of hope in other people, seeing as she does end up reluctantly going along with Giles and reluctantly helping out Angel. She's more like our Buffy but meaner, rather than our Buffy but with different life experience. It's very one-on-one stuff. She is cynical, but she's still Buffy deep down, yada yada yada. It probably doesn't help that this is one of Sarah Michelle Gellar's weakest turns in the character. She does not do the hard-ass thing well. Her performance always feels like it's one beat away from turning into a joke about Buffy struggling to act cool. The very final thing to mention before moving on is the big final scene, where we get to see the entire cast murder each other in a big climatic battle. It sucks in the best way. It's sort of overdramatic with seemingly infinite slow-mo and this big, sad, over-the-top theme playing very loudly over it. But it really does work because the atmosphere of the Wishverse is so well established. This doesn't feel like a pointless brawl. It really does feel like the end of hope and the victory of evil in this particular timeline, and it's pretty genuinely sad, especially when it plays with context from the timeline we know. Buffy testing Xander moments before getting killed by the Master, which I remind you is an event Xander brings her back from in season 1, feels like a kick in the gut. And because Willow and Oz are shown early in the episode to still care about each other even after the events of Lover's Walk, the part where Oz dusts Willow is also genuinely pretty devastating. Giles being absent from all of it and fixing the timeline through sheer stubborn belief in a better world is actually pretty damn rad. It's not sad at all. I really, really like The Wish. This season is so astonishing, man. It's so good. I'm about to take a bit of a turn into the negative for a few episodes. I don't like Amends, and the couple episodes after that are good, but not like The Wish good. But man, this stretch of 4 episodes, it's just unbelievable. Writing about it has done nothing but solidify in my mind what an incredible achievement this is. It's genuinely mind-boggling to have this much quality so tightly packed together. Season 3 doesn't have my favorite overarching plot in Buffy, and I think if I picked my favorite episodes of the show in order, it would probably take a while for me to get to anything from season 3, the Bush being what I'd get to first, but it's such a consistently fantastic season. There's so much incredible material, and it's just a joy. I try to be analytical in my writing, and I hate doing the thing where I cop out by saying, like, it's just good or it's just fun, even though I've done it a couple times already in the script and the previous videos. But man, the experience of watching season 3 is just joyful. I don't know, I think I've earned a little bit of emotionality at this. I really love this show, man. It's so good. I'm so happy to be rewatching it. Anyway, time to shit on a part of the show. Amends is my least favorite episode of the season, and it comes down to what I'm realizing is maybe my cardinal sin for Buffy episodes. I think it's really boring. I mentioned late Buffy generic plot-centric episodes when I was talking about Lover's Walk early in the video. Lover's Walk represents that style succeeding. Amends also has some of that feeling, but on the absolute end of the spectrum, it feels like where later Buffy falters. Those connecting plot episodes that can actually be pretty dull from time to time. Amends is an Angel-centric episode, and it's actually quite an important one. It sort of represents the end of Angel's arc in Buffy. The fact that this happens less than halfway into the season is part of the problem, and the start of what will define him throughout Angel the show. The episode is named Amends because that's what Angel will fight through throughout the rest of his existence as a character. If you look at Amends thematically, it's actually pretty solid, especially if you're willing to squint a little. Maybe my favorite thing about the episode is it's a really bold choice because it marks the start of Angel's redemption arc from a point of failure and weakness. By the end of this episode, Angel has lost the fight for his own soul. He's given up on trying to make amends. He's thrown in the towel and made a conscious attempt to end his own life by standing in the sun, only to be saved by a miraculous snowstorm. When we first see him in LA in his own show, this is sort of his baseline, and he'll have to fight his way up from here, slowly finding a new purpose for his life now that he's not fighting for Buffy anymore. The problem is that Writing is more than just theme, it's also execution, and Amends' execution is tedious. Throughout most of the episode, all we see from Angel is just uninteresting flashbacks of Angelus being evil and killing people, which, we know we saw Angelus for half of last season. Or we also get Angel sort of moping around Sunnydale having guilt-ridden hallucinations, where the first evil is trying to seduce him into being evil again, which never feels substantive. We know Angel's not going to turn again just because it'd be such a hokey, repetitive way to spend the third season, and Buffy is clearly a better show than that, than to repeat what we've done in season 2. Plus, we've already set up the mayor. It's not interesting material, and though the stories do add up to more than the sum of their parts on paper, the actual process of watching them is not good. It feels like we're being fed information we already know in a boring and unimaginative packet. I always forget that Amends is actually a Joss Whedon episode, but watching it, it does show at times. It's got some great dialogue on the sidelines. I really enjoy the follow-ups on the events of Lover's Walk from the Scoobies, particularly Cordelia and Oz. Cordelia is bitchy in the way that she was in season 1, but now it feels justified, and Willow sort of even gives it to her.
She certainly has reverted to form.
It's not her fault. After what happened, we gotta cut her some slack.
That's the Christmas spirit.
Meanwhile, Oz and Willow make up in one of my favourite scenes involving the two of them. I mentioned in season 2 that I think Whedon is the only writer who is really capable of dialing in the edge between Oz being sarcastic and stoic and too cool to care with his gooey inner core, and this scene is a perfect example of that tightrope walk, where Oz's demeanour is very clearly on the edge of cracking, but he's still able to admit to a lot of his emotions without losing his cool. At the same time, Oz is being fair to himself here, and while he forgives Willow for betraying him in the way she did, he's not excessively kind about it. There's an air that he knows that his forgiveness is his to give, and he only gives it out because he thinks he'll be happier this way, which is completely justified here in every possible way. Faith has a fairly simple but genuinely good arc throughout the episode, which I think is a good setup to the coming heel turn in Bad Girls and Consequences, both setting up her isolation and giving us a heartwarming moment to keep us both attached to Faith and hopeful she will get better. Buffy invites Faith to spend Christmas over at Buffy and Joyce's place, but she declines, making up a big party she's been invited to. There's some awkward tension between the two of them. Buffy tries to bridge the gap, Faith sort of dodges, and then eventually shows up at Buffy's home to spend Christmas anyways. It's nothing deep, but it's a pretty spot-on encapsulation of Faith as a character at this point in the story. Prickly, unwilling or unable to make connections, but deeply lonely. I think it's pretty clever to have the moment where she joins Buffy and Joyce play as a heartwarming one as well, since it enables the audience to be in the headspace of the Scoobies, not seeing the threat that Faith's isolation poses to the group. There is not much here, but it is a very good moment. Also, Xander. He feels bad for being awful about Angel, which is much appreciated, and he wants to help, probably to compensate a little bit.
Where do we start? Look, I'm aware I haven't been the mostest best friend to you when it comes to the whole Angel thing. And, I don't know, maybe I finally got the Hanukkah spirit.
He also has the funniest scene in the episode trying to interrogate Willie the Snitch.
So, what can I do for you? A couple of drinks?
Yeah, let me get a double shot of information, pal.
3 priests. They call themselves
The Bringers.
Bringers. Harbingers. They have a no eyes kind of look.
Doesn't ring a bell.
How about I ring that bell for you? Does the threatening come now?
Hey, you did great, by the way. I was very intimidated by you.
Really? Thanks.
Let's go.
It's very good, but that's sort of the thing, is all I have to say about Amends is it has great sideline moments when it's honestly a pretty pivotal episode to the structure of the show. Watching Angel amble about feeling bad isn't enjoyable, and it certainly doesn't tell us anything new about his character. Bringing Jenny Calendar back is a brief moment of adrenaline, but she's not utilized interestingly, being little more than just a stand-in for the first evil that lets it actually speak to Angel on screen, so that David Boreanaz can talk to something other than in a DR'd voice. The payload at the end, with Angel attempting suicide only to be saved by the miracle snow, is nominally something, but by that point I'm disengaged enough by the Angel story that it just doesn't work for me, and the episode doesn't really feel like it's earned such an important climax. I think honestly the big issue here is that the Angel plot hasn't been particularly effective throughout season 3. I've basically not had anything to say about it, and while I've been considerably more positive about it than I was through the first season, I think it's more similar to that season than it is to season 2. A lot of it feels like it's coasting by on season 2 coattails, with the on-screen chemistry between Angel and Buffy being largely gone, and the audience just being expected to care about their relationship because of what went on in the second season, both when their relationship and on-screen chemistry was actually pretty good and when Angelus was around. It falls back into the pitfall of season 1, where we're not allowed to have moments where we really see Buffy and Angel connecting and being happy together, which was the reason I cared for them at all in season 2. It's all drama with them all the time, and it's hard to want them to be together when it seems all it produces for the two of them is a lot of heartache and a lot of scenes that make me feel bad when I watch them. It's not always 100% ineffective in the season, but I find myself very hard-pressed to care when the show really wants me to, which is especially weird when the show nails the relationships between Xander and Cordelia and Willow and us so hard. Seeing Xander and Cordelia dorkishly flirt is so cute, and the two of them clearly enjoy it so much that when that's taken away, I'm genuinely pretty sad. This means that even though Buffy gives a pretty well-written intense speech at the end of the episode, including what's effectively the tagline of Angel the show,
Strong is fighting. It's hard, and it's painful, and it's every day.
I'm not that motivated. I don't care about Angel's inner turmoil because the episode's messed up making it interesting, and I don't care about the Buffy and Angel angle because the season can only hitch a ride on the goodwill generated by the second season for so long before it feeling like it's on autopilot. Oh, also, this first evil thing seems like it'd be a really important concept. Boy, I sure hope there's a whole season oriented around it and that season is... Well, I hope it's not consistent in quality with Amends. I wonder how many upset comments I'm getting for that one. I also wonder how many of them will be defending Season 7 from the Amends allegations, and how many of them will be defending Amends from the Season 7 allegations. Everyone is going to be mad at that one. The next 3 episodes are pretty interesting. We're about to enter another throuple of Monster of the Week episodes, which does not unfortunately reach the heights of episodes 6 through 9, but which has a lot of substance to it. What makes them interesting to me is that they are episodes that the Buffy fandom doesn't really seem to agree on. The first, Gingerbread, is probably the most disliked out of all of them, taking a pretty dire 115th place on the 5 phenomenon, but I still see a decent amount of people enjoying it, and it's easy to see why, especially since I'm one of those people. Don't get me wrong, Gingerbread is not like a phenomenal episode. It's incredibly heavy-handed and beating a moral drum in a way that we've not seen since all the way back in season 1 with things like I Robot You, Jane. This is an episode about moral panics and how they're weaponized to hurt the innocent, and it's not subtle about it, with Sunnydale effectively going on a full-on witch hunt. That said, while it's not subtle, I also don't think it's inaccurate or condescending, and it's honestly possible that the episode has aged better into the age of the internet, where bigots have turned finding people to pin the problems of society into a sport, searching for CRT, DEI, or whatever the fuck the 3-letter buzzword of the day is under every rock. Still, there is a very distinctly 90s vibe to this witch hunt, very reminiscent of the moral panics over heavy metal in Dungeons & Dragons, which were turning our kids into Satanists back in the day. It's possible that I'm only capable of enjoying this episode as a younger person who didn't live through those moral panics, and as such is a level removed from the reality of them, but the flavor in itself is pretty much nailed. I think Joyce is phenomenal in this episode as she slowly falls to the siren's call of scapegoating witches for all the problems in Sunnydale, and while some people are rubbed the wrong way by the fact that kind motherly Joyce is doing this, I think the fact that it's very clearly a product of demonic possession is a pretty clean band-aid fix. Buffy is pretty consistent that people are not morally responsible for the actions they take when possessed or mind-controlled. Obviously, you'll have Angelus and Angel who are distinct different characters, characters, but you also have stuff like Xander possessed by the hyena spirit, or half the cast mind-controlled by the bad eggs. They're not even remotely held responsible for, eating Principal Flutie. That means that Joyce is sort of the perfect fit, because we know she's well-meaning, and one of the most insidious aspects of these types of moral panics is how they can turn that well-meaning into an instrument of harm. Legitimately, all that Joyce wants to do is protect the kids, which is such a cliche I can see why it would cause eye rolls, but, tune into the Daily Wire for half a minute. That's still all they fucking talk about. It's still the rallying cry of bigots everywhere, and it deserves to be lampooned in this way. But more than that, Joyce is the perfect fit because Christine Sutherland can just go ham on the mom vibes and be fantastic with it. There's so many times where she can absolutely carry the episode on her back and is able to completely portray Joyce as a concerned, middle-aged, middle-class white woman. She simply breathes the role. One of my big problems with other episodes that go this hard on their messaging is they feel condescending, but Gingerbread really doesn't. It's very clearly taking the sledgehammer approach, and it's clearly not because it thinks the audience is too dumb to get it. I mean, this is Jane Espenson, who will prove in spades that she respects the audience's ability to pick out subtlety. Gingerbread goes ham with the whole deal because it's effective to do so. It's a disturbing descent into madness and harm that is able to be played both straight and camp at the same time. The episode has a great knack for simultaneous humor and horror, especially both with Joyce and Willow's moms, who keep the concerned woman tone even as they're starting 1984-like dystopian organizations. It's a very fun parody of the very thing it's doing, and I think a lot of the episode's unpopularity comes from taking it too seriously. It's playful, and it's fun, and it's disturbing, and I enjoy it a good amount despite the fact that it's overcrowded and the third act is a rushed mess. Gingerbread is a good time, and like seemingly every episode at this point, it's completely full to the brim of great little moments on the sidelines. Willow's mom is delightfully horrible, Amy's back for some reason, and you get really funny lines like this.
Buffy, hi.
Hey, is Willow around?
How can I convince you people that it's over? You assume because I am here, she's here, that I somehow mysteriously know where she is.
Those her books?
Yeah, she's in the bathroom.
I really do wonder if it's an episode that's aged gracefully, because I think the current political climate in the West is a real boon to it. I also think that's a connective tissue because the next episode, Helpless, is one I know for a fact has grown popular with time, from a relatively humble 63rd place on the Five phenomenon, which is just above average, back in 2003, to an episode that I very often hear being praised nowadays. Unlike Gingerbread, though, I can't say I am actually a massive enjoyer of it. It might be a better episode, but I enjoy it less, partially due to a less enjoyably goofy tone, and partially just because I like what it's doing less. It's also, admittedly, needs a lot less defending, seeing as Gingerbread is all the way down at 115 on the Five phenomenon. Helpless is David Fury's first solo showing, at this point still working as a freelancer, and I think it's a pretty good one at that. Even if I don't enjoy what it's aiming to do, I think it executes it very competently and is one of the more genuinely tense episodes of the show thus far, with some of the most realistically brutal stakes since School Hard. But there is a lot of scaffolding that needs to be built up for it to work, and I just do not think a lot of that scaffolding is great. First off, we've got a continuation of the Angel plot, where Buffy and him are training together and are horny. I don't like it, because frankly I just want Angel to go away to LA already so he can have his own show, and his presence in this one just feels like so much treading of water, especially knowing how good he's gonna be in his own show. The worst part of the Buffy and Angel scene is that once Buffy leaves, we cut to her doing crystal training, all while stroking a suspiciously long and straight crystal. At first, I thought this was just my mind being fucking disgusting, but no, the writer's commentary track confirms this is intended. Buffy is stroking a giant crystal penis, and I fucking hate it so much I can't stand it. This is the worst episode of the show now. I had to learn this, so you have to learn it too, and I hope you hate it as much as I do. Why? I think the thing that Helpless really does nail is the emotion of it all. While the episode's overarching plot doesn't suck me in, the moment-to-moment is really good, and it's an episode that becomes better on a rewatch, where you can pick up the nuances that are covered up by the central mystery. The standout for me is, as he often is, Anthony Head, who is absolutely incredible at portraying Giles as awkwardly and ashamedly lying to Buffy without being too obvious about it on a first watch. I think as I watch the show more and more, what I keep realizing is that Head is a phenomenal supporting actor, in the sense that he's much better at quieter scenes than the young members of the cast are. Sarah Michelle Gellar is a phenomenal actress, and she really does nail Buffy in the loud emotional moments where she's breaking apart. Alison Hannigan, on the other hand, is incredibly able to nail in Willow's slightly neurotic emotionality, jumping from nervous to overconfident in believable ways, all while projecting immense vulnerability. And Nick Brendan is incredibly funny and charming in a way that really lets him take expository scenes and make himself the center, carrying us through what may otherwise be dry or boring on his sheer overwhelming charisma, but these are all obvious and center stage performances. More and more, I find myself really impressed by Anthony Head's ability to really get Giles and his emotions across while still ceding the scene to one of his co-workers. I think such a big part of why Giles is able to be developed so well is that Anthony Head's acting allows the writers to quietly let us know more about Giles in scenes that aren't explicitly about Giles. Because Anthony Head is so capable of acting quietly, we can have a highly understandable Giles growth moment in the background of a scene where Buffy or Xander or Willow takes the lead, without taking anything away from them, but still letting Giles' scene speak. Admittedly, Helpless might not be the best moment to bring this up because it's not actually making use of Head in that way per se. He is not teaching us anything about Giles throughout the episode, but man, he's just incredible. The distracted shame and distance portrayed by Giles throughout the episode is heartbreaking, and it's especially good when the writing really supports it. Like when Buffy's dad flakes on their ice skating date, and Giles just completely misses Buffy's signals that she wants him there.
If someone were free, they'd take their daughters or their student or their slayer.
Yes, but Buffy, I think we should concentrate now.
The episode really focuses on the parental relationship between Buffy and Giles because, as is becoming usual with the show, we focus on a good thing right when we're about to ruin it. In this case, Giles ends up seriously betraying Buffy and losing her confidence. It's a really devastating scene where the only issue is that it doesn't stick, which, come to think of it, is a weird recurring problem when Buffy and Giles come into conflict. I don't really blame the episode for it not sticking, though. Cutting Giles out would effectively remove him from the show, at least for a bit, and he is one of the best aspects of it. But a big emotional scene like this being undercut in the very same episode is at least a little unsatisfying. At least the scene at the end where Buffy and Giles have reconciled due to his heroism in trying to save her, and finally standing up to the Watchers Council, is very touching as well. This is the first we really see of the Watchers Council, and what I found interesting is that this is largely a David Fury original idea. Quentin Travers is going to be semi-recurring, by which I mean he will show up again, but he feels like a foundational character for the Buffyverse, really representing this gross, patriarchal, and ultimately incompetent bureaucratic body of the Watchers Council. There is a very definite shift going into season 3, where in the first 2 seasons the Watchers were sort of taken for granted as a positive force, but more and more we're going to see them encroaching onto the Slayer's authority in this condescending patriarchal manner of theirs, and I think it's a really great metaphor for the oppression brought about by patriarchy. In particular, the way we just sort of see it as a semi-benevolent fact of life not to be questioned for the first 2 seasons is pretty appropriate, I think, even if it's just recontextualizing something that definitely wasn't intended in this season. Giles' firing at the end of the episode is also basically improvised, with Whedon and Fury only coming up with it in the course of writing the episode. That's insane, seeing how big of an impact it has on the rest of the season. Though, of course, it's really likely that Wesley was going to be a character in the future no matter what, probably as Faith's exclusive watcher. I've not mentioned any of the central thing of the episode because that's the bit that I don't find that interesting. Because of Giles' betrayal, Buffy is slowly losing her Slayer powers and ends up locked in a house, helpless even, with a crazy vampire who's captured Joyce and intends to turn Buffy. It's not bad by any means, and I think Buffy's powers failing do cause some really good moments of tension. There is a bit where she tries to stand up to someone who's harassing Cordelia and doesn't immediately just smash them to pieces, which is incredibly shocking to see. It's crazy how well ingrained the fact that Buffy is a machine is in my brain, to the point where seeing her not insta-win a fight against a human feels so incredibly wrong and off-putting. There is a couple moments like that against vampires too, which feels similarly disturbing, but it's only a visceral reaction, and ultimately there's not much more substance to it than that. The same can be said about Buffy's scuffle with Kralik. It's a really great tense action scene that can be genuinely pretty scary in the moment, but ultimately, that's all it is, and for how good it is, it ends up taking too much of the episode's real estate so that I can't really be all that enthusiastic about it. Kralik too is a fun, disturbing guy, so I don't have an issue with the quality of what the episode is doing. I'm just not really all that interested. Writing this has made me realize that I really do respect Helpless. I went on about a lot of what's good about it for quite a while, so thematically I guess it is pretty satisfying, and I legitimately think it's well crafted. Unlike other liked episodes that I have a personal grudge against, I don't have anything against it really, I just don't enjoy it. Not every good episode is for me, and that's okay. Helpless is good, it's just not really my cup of tea. The final episode of this controversial trio, and of this video, is the Zeppo. This is one of the show's most unique episodes, and I think I might have a bias for interesting ideas like this one, because I love this episode to absolute bits, despite not necessarily thinking it sticks the landing. The Zeppo's unique point is that it's probably the purest encapsulation of a character-focused episode in all of Buffy. We are incredibly firmly planted within Xander's perspective throughout the entire episode, with only very brief cutaways to the rest of the Scoobies, who are going through a big dramatic storyline that we are barely privy to, because the episode's central theme is Xander feeling inadequate for the Scoobies and sort of being left out of the group. This is a perfectly good theme for the episode, and the way it's conveyed is very powerful, by completely distancing the viewer from the comically overdramatic central Scooby plot. We're all that more likely to feel Xander's distance and insecurity here. The issue is that it does feel contrived because the Scoobies wouldn't do this. They've faced 2 apocalypses together by this point and plenty of other life or death situations, and even when Xander's not been able to do anything, they've always kept him around and in the loop so that he can at least attempt to research or give his thoughts on how to deal with the situation. To a large extent, the episode tries to hide how out of character they're acting through comedy. Everyone is incredibly extra in this episode, and the idea of this apocalypse happening and the viewer not being let in to look at it is very funny. It's one of the episode's best jokes. However, there is a subtle distinction there that makes me not buy it. We are not in a cartoony different version of the world here. We might never hear about this apocalypse, and it might be funny to observe it from the outside, but the Scoobies are ultimately meant to be themselves. Everything we see them do is true to their character, other than excluding Xander. This might seem like making a mountain out of a molehill, but I think it's the foundation on which my issues with the Zeppo lie. The episode itself is incredibly fun, one of my favorites as I have said, and it's replete with good Xander moments. But ultimately, the very premise of the thing is shaky. It's partially an episode about Xander overcoming the growing distance between him and the Scoobies due to his inability to help, but that growing distance neither has been nor will be present in any other episode this season, and it's not properly sold within this episode, so that part of his arc feels hollow and contrived. Luckily, as Cordelia helpfully points out, the bit where he's sort of useless and insecure is very much grounded in Xander's character, and as such can mostly carry the episode. The words useless and insecure are 2 of the most accurate descriptions of the guy, right there with funny, charismatic, sometimes big-hearted, often scummy, and doltish. That's a good word. The Zeppo's real strength lies in displaying all of these characteristics of Xander while maintaining an incredibly energetic and fun tone, while still ultimately telling a story of personal growth. This is Dan Vebber's follow-up to Lover's Walk and Farewell to Buffy, and while the episode's tone is vastly different, his touch for enjoyable character moments is completely here. They range from subtle little jokes that aren't really remarks upon.
I mean, you yourself, Oz, are considered more or less cool. Why is that?
Am I?
Is it about the talking? You know, the way you tend to express yourself in short, non-committal phrases?
Could be.
to big old goofy set-piece moments, like Xander showing up looking the most possible like an uncool guy's idea of a cool guy in his car, but they're all perfect, and for how little we see of the other Scoobies, they all get their own pretty good moments as well. I already pointed out this very fun line Oz gets in a overall pretty fun scene, but there's also stuff like Cordelia, who essentially exists in this episode to verbalize Xander's insecurities at the screen, beating down Xander completely. Or the hilariously over-the-top self-parodying Buffy and Angel scene, which Xander awkwardly interrupts.
Hey, this is my fight. And if you won't do it my way, then you're...
Hey. I've got this, There's this, This is probably a bad time. Can I help?
Which, as someone who's constantly frustrated at this couple, feels very on point. Or the small beat where Xander runs into a very stressed Willow and she, platonically, tells him she loves him. It's replete with incredibly solid character beats, both heartfelt and comedic, and its ability to bounce between the two with such ease is very impressive. As I've said for a lot of episodes this season, this is all on the sidelines though, and the main thrust of the episode is no slouch, thankfully, where in his pursuit of meaning, Xander falls in with a gang of delinquent zombies who are planning to set off a bomb at the school. The main thrust throughout most of the episode is Xander being unable, or perhaps afraid, to say no to anyone. He sort of gets caught up in all this because the zombies just sort of drag him along and he never gets away, slowly being forced into more and more intense things, from resurrecting a bunch of these zombie guys to robbing a shop and building a bomb to like getting killed himself, all of which are effectively played for laughs. The zombies' leader, O'Toole, is an incredibly fun character who's an obviously psychotic weirdo. The performance here is excellent, and it's made crystal clear from the start of the episode how intimidated Xander is by him, which makes the very simple moment where Xander mans up and actually stands up to him, because this time it matters, incredibly satisfying and full of momentum, especially considering the hell spiral Xander's gone through to get to this point. It helps that, despite Xander often taking the role of the comedic idiot, he is fairly competent here. Even though it takes him way too long to decipher what baking a cake means, he does ultimately come up with his own plan to stop the zombies, and it does work, giving him a much needed burst of confidence by the end of the episode. One of my favourite bits of this episode is this bit.
But the world continues to turn.
No one will ever know how close it came to stopping. Never know what we did.
Guys?
Xander.
Where the double entendre is tons of fun, but still ultimately heartfelt, because this is Xander's version of what the Scoobies were going through. Ultimately, the episode point is that Xander is less useful than the other Scoobies, but he does still contribute, and the fact that he tags along and goes through these big ordeals is ultimately just as heroic. The other Scoobies may have just faced down the apocalypse, as opposed to Xander, who just got in a scuffle with a few zombies, but they're the Slayer, an incredibly powerful vampire, a witch in training, a highly experienced and knowledgeable watcher, and a werewolf. Xander is just a guy, and so he has his more mundane, basic scuffles, but they don't require any less bravery or skill. It's a really good parallel. There is 3 more points that I want to make before we move on. First off, Insane Car Girl is great. She's really funny. We all know a person like this. She wants to fuck the cars. It's great. Second, Xander has sex with Faith in this episode, and it's going to be significant later because this is a really meaningful moment to him, whereas it's clear from the get-go that Faith is just doing this because she's horny. The scene feels bad to watch and is effective, but it's ultimately not really of this episode per se. It's set up for future Xander stuff. Third, the Zeppo establishes you can just bring people back to life as zombies. This is a bad thing to establish, and so the show will basically ignore it from this point on, because otherwise death would be meaningless. You could read it as just that, or you could read it as Xander being too dumb to bring up that this is possible with the Scoobies, and that a guy in Sunnydale knows how to do it, despite the many situations in which it's going to be relevant in the future. The latter is definitely funnier, and I mean, that's it for now. I think it's very appropriate to end the video here, since we've just dealt with the worst threat that the Scoobies have faced in the entire show so far in the very last episode. Angel says so himself.
This is worse than anything we've ever faced.
Next time, we're going to be jumping into Bad Girls and Consequences, a lowering of the stakes, but it's the point at which the season's narrative really kicks off in what I'd call the Faith arc. It's actually really interesting to see this happen. For one, it happens almost in the same episode of the season as Innocence. Surprise and Innocence probably kicked off season 2's plot, and they were episodes 13 and 14. This two-parter happens in episodes 14 and 15, and we come out of the other end of them with someone becoming evil. But what really stuck with me rewatching this season is how localized Faith as a character is. I have mentioned her quite a few times in my recap, but she's been almost entirely absent since Revelations, with only a couple significant mentions. Her arc has been effectively primed since that point, and the time in between has only served to ratchet up the tension and let us stew in her feeling of isolation. Faith is just as important in my perception of Season 3 as that string of really good episodes earlier on, but she's actually not that interesting or significant of a character until fairly late in the season, which threw me a bit off guard on a rewatch. But mostly, I think early Season 3 is just so astonishingly impressive. This video is called The Highest Point in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and it's not necessarily accurate, because my favourite episode of the show, which would be the pointiest of high points in the most literal sense, isn't in Season 3. But like all my titles, I stand by it hardcore. My massively overlong Season 2 video was 32,000 words long, and it covered 22 episodes in what at points was excessive detail. Before the editing process, this video was just under 24,000 words long, 2/3 the length for just over half the amount of episodes, meaning I've spent roughly 1.5 times as many words per episode, much of which is concentrated in episodes I really like. Since then, I've added about 2,000 more words in the editing process and a bunch of ad-libs as I was recording, meaning that I spent even more than 1.5 times as much per episode. The level of quality in this first half of the season is completely mind-blowing. Once you get past a few mediocre episodes at the start of the season, it's just banger after banger after banger. At a surface level, it feels bad to be this in love with this half of this season specifically, because other than season 1, this arguably has the least of what made Buffy special when it was airing, that serialized connected nature where everything sticks and matters. It's a bit of a meandering, atomized half of a season, full of standalone episodes that don't really have plot significance, and which is just really good by themselves. I say at a surface level, because other than the incredible moment-to-moment writing, I really do think the secret sauce here is character evolution. Despite the events of most of these episodes ultimately not mattering, the character growth in them really does, and it sticks through to other episodes and even other seasons, making the whole thing feel coherent and feel whole. I really do love this approach to writing, and the fact that it's replete with episodes that are breathtakingly brilliant while being funny and breezy doesn't hurt either. I honestly don't think that TV has ever been better than this specific set of 13 episodes. I'm not sure it ever will be better either. See you next time when Buffy goes shoplifting.